live stream. Please adjust your audio accordingly. This is the California State University Office of the Chancellor's live stream. Please adjust your audio accordingly. This is the California State University Office of the Chancellor's live stream. Please adjust your audio accordingly. This is the California State University Office of the Chancellor's live stream. Please
welcome to this very kind of intimate, humble abode here with the Cal State University at the Chancellor's office, the Dumke Auditorium. I would like to welcome you all to the Joint Legislative Committee on Emergency Management hearing. Today's hearing, this is the last of 3 hearings. Today's hearing is entitled, When Free Speech Crosses the Line, Protecting Public Safety in California. I'm State Senator Hannah Beth Jackson. I represent the 19th Senate District, which is all of Santa Barbara County and Western Ventura County. And I am honored to be the chair of this joint committee and want to extend a very warm welcome to the other folks who are here today, particularly my colleague, Senator Richard Roth, who also is an attorney and someone who probably has asked as many times as those of us who read the Constitution and try to figure out just exactly when speech is protected and when it is unprotected. It reminds me a bit of how we have tried historically to define pornography, and we define pornography that you know it when you see it, which isn't exactly a great guidepost, but hopefully with this whole issue of when is speech no longer protected because it's encouraging violence. We know you can't shout fire in a movie theater. When else can you or can you not speak in a way that either one could argue could engender violence or in fact is likely to do so? So that's really kind of the gist of what we are hoping to discuss today. And again, I want to thank all of our distinguished witnesses and guests for joining us, and to everyone who is going to be watching this over television and the internet remotely. And I want to also thank the California State Chancellor's Office for hosting us in this rather impressive building today. Thank you so much for your hospitality. And we are today again focusing on the third part of our 3-part series dealing with our state's readiness for handling potentially violent so-called free speech events. Some would call them hate speech events. Some would call them provocative events. These are marches, political rallies, protests, and demonstrations, often for the purpose of speaking and protesting and taking a position, but oftentimes meant to provoke a hostile or confrontational response. And these hearings were essentially set up in response to the specific incident that happened at the University of Virginia campus in Charlottesville when a group of white supremacists marched through the main quadrangle of that building in a torchlit process to mark the beginning of a weekend of events, ostensibly to protest a decision by the city of Charlottesville to remove a statue of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee from a downtown city park. A legitimate statement. People were in support of that decision. People were opposed to it. Definitely something that people should and felt entitled to respond to one way or the other. However, that action accelerated and resulted in the death of a 32-year-old counter-protester named Heather Heyer and the injury to another 34 people. That is not, I don't believe any of us would believe that that is not what the First Amendment was designed to protect. But then the question is, what is the First Amendment designed to protect? And unfortunately, the reality of our times is that events like this are being staged more frequently as this nation becomes more polarized, less tolerant, less welcoming of other points of view. And so we are finishing up this discussion today to try to get a sense of just exactly what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, and then when we find ourselves in that sort of tweener state, what is being done, and you are the experts on how to address those, the operational aspects, I would say, of maintaining public safety at these very provocative rallies and marches. And we have had a number of other incidents since the situation in Charlottesville. We had one in the Capitol in Sacramento last year, which became another vivid example of clash between neo-Nazi demonstrators and counter-protesters right on the lawn in front of the state capitol. And we've seen others in the Bay Area. There have been a number of these activities and efforts to try to contain them. We've had them at, I think, UCLA and Long Beach and Fullerton. They seem to be the rule, not the exception. Whereas most rallies are without violence, and I applaud the work that you do, I know, behind the scenes on many of them. What it has been brought to our attention and what we do need to address and tackle is those incidents which do turn violent and where human life is at risk and people are in jeopardy. So the first hearing we had was entitled Combating Hate While Protecting the Constitution. We held that hearing at the beginning of October up in Sacramento and focused on the First Amendment, the right of free speech, the very First Amendment to our Constitution, and talked about the circumstances when that right can be limited and the impact that protected hate speech has on targeted communities. A couple weeks later, the Senate Public Safety Committee held the second hearing in this series entitled Violent Protests and Police Response, which focused on California's law enforcement training standards for handling protests and controlling crowds, as well as challenges in enforcing and prosecuting hate crimes. This hearing today, as I mentioned, is going to consider the operational aspects. Our first panel will focus on how intelligence and threat assessment can help public safety officials, university administrators, and the managers of our public spaces to identify groups and events where violence could erupt. The second panel will pick up where the first left off and consider how potential violence can be mitigated or controlled through advanced planning. So we have assessment, we have planning, event time, place, and manner restrictions, which have been deemed to be acceptable and not in any way violative of First Amendment rights, and crowd management, another issue, of course, which doesn't impede First Amendment rights, but is something that we try to use as a tool to protect speech and also public safety. And the third panel will discuss how public safety response plans are executed should an event turn violent, as well as strategies to de-escalate violence before it becomes widespread so that the speech or the demonstration or what have you can continue in a peaceful fashion. And I'm particularly interested in hearing from our panelists about the point at which you deem that speech crosses over the line into violence and what the criteria is that you use to make that determination. I think this is going to be an interesting discussion. I think it's an important one. I'd like to ask those of you who have specific firsthand experience with this to give us examples where you did your work, examples of what was going on through your mind as you were trying to assess and determine whether or not that speech would be allowed to continue, what tools you may have used to de-escalate a potentially violent situation, and then when did you decide to shut it all down? So that perhaps that can help give us some sense of, again, you look at that piece of pornography and decide, yep, it is, or nope, it isn't. You know, it's really something that we're always trying to hone down so that we can, in the case of the First Amendment, protect the public. And I'm going to turn this over to Senator Roth for, if he has a couple brief opening remarks. He doesn't. He's a smart man. Less is more. But I do want to thank him particularly for coming. And I also want to thank my staff, Toby Halverson, who has worked very hard to put this together with Fernando Ramirez, the youngest member of our staff, who has been learning very quickly and been a tremendous help to us, even though he is just a kid. No, he's not just a kid. He's a young man who's really joined our staff and is also very enthusiastic about the work that we're doing today. So let's go now. We have till 4:30. We're going to offer people 2 minutes at the end if there's public comment. Would ask you to speak for 2 minutes, identify yourself and your affiliation, and then share with us your thoughts. At this point, though, we're going to start with our intelligence and threat assessment. We have with us Alberto Martinez, the Deputy Director of the Orange County Intelligence Assessment Center and Secretary of the National Fusion Center Association, and Eli Owen, who is the Acting Commander for the State Threat Assessment Center, the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Thank you for being here, and if you'd like to go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Senator Jackson and Senator Roth. Thank you for the invitation today to speak in front of you today regarding this important issue, the safety and security of our public. As my name is Alberto Martinez, and I'm speaking in the capacity as the Secretary of the National Fusion Center Association. I'm currently the Deputy Director of the Orange County Intelligence Assessment Center here in Southern California. We are one of the 79 fusion centers in the national network of fusion centers across the U.S. and its territories. The OCAC is also one of the 6 California fusion centers which make up the State Threat Assessment System, or STAS. Fusion centers are operated by state and local agencies with the support of general funds by partner agencies and federal Homeland Security grant program funding. Fusion centers bring together public safety components from state, local, and federal law enforcement, fire service, emergency management, public health, critical infrastructure and key resources, and private sector personnel to understand local implications of national intelligence. Fusion centers are responsible for digesting national intelligence and analyzing information with relevant local contexts, thus enabling us, local law enforcement, and state officials to better protect our communities. Fusion centers are designed to receive and collate and analyze and disseminate suspicious behavior under the National Suspicious Activity Reporting Initiative, or National NSI, to better identify criminal behavior potentially indicative of terrorism or criminal behavior. With the advancement of the digital age, identifying violent behavior online can be a challenge for law enforcement. The vetting of suspicious behavior online is cloudy between those individuals supporting a foreign terrorist organization and those individuals supporting domestic terrorism extremist ideologies. Fusion centers and law enforcement are attempting to balance physical realities with those in the virtual reality. Law enforcement and fusion centers across the nation are receiving an uptick in requests for information to vet online activity and behaviors for potential violence involving activity constitutionally protected under the First Amendment. Law enforcement agencies, including my higher education partners today, are adamantly developing event action plans with mutual aid support for preparing for potential violence. In many cases, the only gauge we in law enforcement have and fusion centers to prepare for these events is information identified through online resources, essentially using publicly available information off the internet. Fusion centers are being leveraged daily to review publicly available information to assist law enforcement in planning for potential activities. Based on known and unknown information, intelligence, and or specific historical observation, some protective activities have invited a violent reaction towards the events with a goal of stopping the protective activity from occurring. Law enforcement and fusion centers may potentially identify individuals and or groups potentially participating in violent activities that are protected by the First Amendment. The general public does have a reasonable expectation by law enforcement to assure the safety and security of the public and first responders while adhering to privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights. In 2012, the California Commission on Peace Officer Standards and Training developed a document titled Crowd Management, Intervention, and Control. The post document states that gathering and analyzing of information about an event can dramatically increase the effectiveness of an agency's planning and response to incident involving crowd management, while ensuring law enforcement protects the rights of persons to lawfully assemble and express their opinions, but preserve the peace and use that information to deploy officers for crowd and traffic control. The National Fusion Center Association is assisting law enforcement and Fusion Center personnel in ensuring our public safety partners possess relevant information for operational planning in the interest of protecting the public. In July of this year, the National Network of Fusion Centers, in partnership with the Office of Director of National Intelligence, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and associations represented by the Criminal Intelligence Coordinating Council, developed the Real-Time and Open Source Analysis Guide to assist agencies and fusion centers in understanding the lawful, appropriate use of open source information, specifically focused on social media, and a copy has been provided to the committee today. The Real-Time and Open Source Analysis Guide is designed to help law enforcement agencies and analytical personnel understand the resources available to support law enforcement and operation activities, while assuring the related privacy, civil liberties, and civil rights concerns are addressed. States and local law enforcement and analytical personnel work hard to prevent both crimes before they occur and solve crimes when they're perpetrated. Traditionally, law enforcement agencies have two avenues to do so. That's the development to use criminal intelligence and the conduct of criminal investigations. The Real-Time and Open Source Analysis Guide focuses on the social media component of open source analysis, which is a process used by law enforcement and analytical personnel to leverage publicly facing and available information derived from social media sites. The document itself, Real-Time Open Source Analysis Guide, is developed for three specific areas: to develop or enhance criminal intelligence, including situational awareness reports, support a criminal investigation, and identify public safety risks, either past, present, or anticipated. The third focus of this area allows fusion centers and law enforcement to identify public safety risks online. Through this ROSA process, law enforcement and analysts can gather publicly available information or open source to determine whether criminal activity is occurring to support a criminal investigation or to assess the risk to public safety and information. Fusion centers and law enforcement recognize that real-time and open source analysis information for fusion centers is important across the all crimes, all hazards missions. From detecting crime and terror-related events to helping first responders and individuals in need during emergencies or disasters, to supporting criminal investigations, efficient analysis of public posts on social media platforms has rapidly become essential for fusion centers and other public safety partners to effectively serve and respond to our citizens. With applicable policy and guidance for law enforcement comes challenges. We are continuing to address obstacles to progress in having access to this publicly available information. Popular social media applications have affected law enforcement's ability to timely and effectively respond to and identify potential threats impacting the general public, law enforcement, and government personnel. Policy changes in terms of service updates by social media applications have restricted subscription-based social media analytical software companies from providing data stream access to law enforcement, even though the same data is provided to other paid subscribers, including private sector partners. As time and manpower are spent reviewing bulk data, it's a resource extremely limited to law enforcement and fusion centers. These social media analytical software applications enable analysis of threats or concerns existing in large data sets. Law enforcement is still able to review the information directly from social media applications and platforms. However, it's conducted manually rather than in an efficiently and timely manner capable to the use through these social media applications. Fusion centers across the state of California and the National Network of Fusion Centers continue to support our public safety agencies in attempting to provide timely and relevant threat information. We all recognize that the public has constitutionally protected rights to assemble, speak, and petition the government. We deeply safeguard these rights and will only report on First Amendment activities to protect the public. Senator Jackson and Senator Roth, on behalf of the National Fusion Center Association, thank you for inviting me to testify today. I'll take some questions.
Yes, thank you. From what I hear you saying is that there are businesses that have more ability to access open source information than law enforcement. Is that an accurate statement?
Essentially, we all have access to publicly available information online using social media applications. The challenge is the aggregating that data using third-party applications. So it's recently, last year, Twitter, for example, removed the API access for these third-party applications. So in many cases, fusion centers and law enforcement purchase these third-party applications to digest and analyze a large bulk set of this information. And with the removal of that access to law enforcement, becomes very challenging for us within this panel to identify all threats on publicly available information on the internet.
Is that something that you could otherwise do with a warrant, or do you need more? Is this just you're trying to sort of get a feel for what's going on rather than have a specific pinpointed, if you will, threat?
Well, just in general, having access to the data, it's publicly available. If I post something on the internet, anybody can see it. But in a large data set of our special event, and for example, we assisted California State University Fullerton recently on an event they had just during Halloween, having a bulk set of that information to aggregate versus manually scrolling down and having more analysts, more law enforcement personnel review that information becomes timely, and it takes away from that manpower supporting that event. So if we had access through these applications to review that bulk set of data, it would be a little efficient for all our partners today to access information relevant to public safety concerns.
And the reason that you were was there some concern about this particular special event that might justify having a sort of a, I won't say special dispensation, but if there is a reason for concern, I mean, that's the reason that we generally have the ability to get a warrant. Is this, would that have been untimely, or
unless there were specific threats, the vetting process that we would have to use would take a further investigative step for a warrant. This information is publicly available, and having that information, vetting that information out, providing it to the incident commanders in real time, there's only a handful of cases, but if we had access to the plethora of data that folks are individually posting online, I think it would give us a greater optic of potential threats online.
So because I'm fairly inexperienced with all of this stuff, being of the older generation, when you say the aggregate of this information, how is that information available in this aggregate form?
So essentially, a lot of these social media platforms, the major ones we hear about, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. There's obviously a long line.
I know what those are, but it's the aggregate part of it.
Right. So essentially, they provide. It's called the API data, and these social media applications will allow for other vendors to receive and digest their information online publicly. And for us, there's so much information on the internet, one specific event, one specific platform. By having an assistant, a facilitator of that information, help us digest that bulk set of information online, reviewing potential threats, possibly reviewing potential keywords. We can do that in a more efficient manner versus manually scrolling to identify a specific individual or specific group. Because our challenge in law enforcement that we're not targeting specific individual groups or individuals or groups. We're identifying potential threats, and that's where there's a gray area to kind of identify, hey, what is specifically a threat, and what constitutes someone's First Amendment protective activity.
Okay. Do you have any? Thank you.
Sure.
Maybe I missed it, but what was the reason or the basis for Twitter prohibiting the use of third-party applications to do the aggregation?
So there was a memo released. There was essentially a document came out. The ACLU provided a public document to Twitter indicating that fusion centers are considered spy centers. And that's not what fusion centers are, what we operate. We're operated by state and local agencies. So the information that a watchdog essentially provided to Twitter on the basis of invalid information resulted in Twitter removing access to law enforcement. So for the National Fusion Center Association, we have been working with obviously some of our legislative peers, both here at the state and local, federal level, of assisting us in telling Twitter, for example, we are not spy centers. We're aggregating this information for public safety concerns. And this ROSA document helps us identify that.
Are you making any headway? Is there going to be a change? Or
that I know recently the National Fusion Center has shared just last week with Chairman McCall from the House Homeland Security Committee, and he's currently attempting to identify that opportunity with Twitter and some of the social media platforms, but no update at this time.
we spend a lot of time worrying about privacy issues, but this really isn't a privacy issue. These are messages, data. This is data.
Correct.
That an individual voluntarily chooses to post.
Right.
And if you had the resources, you could go through each individual post, I suppose.
Correct.
For each individual and and secure the data you need.
Correct.
that's just not a very efficient way to do it.
Not efficient, and that's why the National Fusion Center Association, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security created this ROSA document because there was concerns for privacy issues. What is law enforcement doing with this open source information? So we created this document, this guide in July of this year to help law enforcement and fusion centers have a guide to process that information and help us publicly share that this information is being used for public safety concerns, because all of us here on this panel, fusion centers, specifically our center, the OCAIAC, receives weekly requests for information on a special event. And the challenge is that a lot of this information comes online. So how do you digest that information and vet and determine what's specifically a threat? And this document helps us do that.
Well, to the extent that you don't make sufficient progress in fixing and addressing this issue, it's probably something that we need to consider from a legislative standpoint. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
One last question. You say looking for potential threats, not for particular individuals. Could you elaborate a little bit more?
Absolutely. Well, obviously, law enforcement, there's a gray area online. We understand individuals have a reason to petition the government. So in many cases, for these special events, individuals may indicate they're going to conduct a crime online. And I bring an example. Recently, we supported the city of Laguna Beach during a major event in their city. From the initial planning meetings, we were there to support the city and the county of Orange on that event. And prior to the event, we had received information online that an individual had posted publicly that he was going to bring stun guns and other weapons. So the challenge for us is, how do you determine that information? It's publicly available. Is that he or she's First Amendment protective activity? Is that a crime? Is that individual stating he's to conduct violence? So having that information, vetting it out, providing it to the incident commanders in the field helps them potentially protect themselves for violence. Later we find out during that event, law enforcement had located a rebar and other weapons stuck in the sand based on additional information, based on scanning. So having that information, a public post, how do we vet that information, determine that we're infringing on that individual's right to publicly post a photo, or help law enforcement identify, hey, there's potential violence occurring.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Next up is Eli Owen, Acting Commander of the State Threat Assessment Center through the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, Senator. Thank you very much. So I'll start with some opening remarks and then turn it over to questions. Thank you for having me here. It's an honor to speak to you today. The California State Threat Assessment Center, or STAC, is part of the Governor's Office of Emergency Services under Director Mark Ghilarducci, who also serves as the Governor's Homeland Security Advisor. The STAC is California's information sharing clearinghouse of strategic threat analysis and situational awareness. It's the center I help run. STAC supports efforts to prevent, prepare for, mitigate, and respond to all crimes and all hazards impacting California citizens and critical infrastructure, while preserving civil liberties, individual privacy, and constitutional rights. Our mission focuses on the following threats: international and domestic terrorism, transnational crimes such as narcotics and human trafficking, threats to critical infrastructure, and threats developing from emerging and/or disruptive technologies. So think of unmanned aerial systems or Internet of Things and the effects those have on society and our ability to protect the state. Additionally, the STAC is co-located with the California Cybersecurity Integration Center, also known as the CalSIC. This co-location is the physical realization that cybersecurity now encompasses all aspects of life in California, given the above-mentioned threats. The STAC is staffed with subject matter experts and organized into 3 teams: critical infrastructure protection, strategic intelligence, and an operations team. The STAC maximizes information sharing and allows for communications to be properly vetted and classified. This ensures for connectivity between the intelligence community at the federal level, law enforcement, and California's other 5 regional fusion centers, such as the Orange County Intelligence Assessment Center, represented today by Alberto. Aside from the OCAIAC, the other regional fusion centers are the Los Angeles Joint Regional Intelligence Center, San Diego Law Enforcement Coordination Center, Northern California Regional Intelligence Center in San Francisco, and the Central California Intelligence Center in Sacramento. Collectively, the STAC, along with the 5 regional fusion centers, make up the state threat assessment system that Alberto described. In terms of STAC engagement related to protests, there is no engagement until there is a known criminal nexus or threat to public safety or request for assistance from law enforcement partners. When engagement does occur, as with all of our other responsibilities, STAC activities are informed by and guided through strict adherences to all applicable state and federal laws and information sharing guidelines, policies, and regulations. Thank you. And now I'll open it up for questions.
Would you please define and explain a known criminal nexus? What does that mean?
Sure. So, known criminal nexus would be, for example, Alberto gave some examples of openly posted references either on some variety of social media platforms such as Twitter, a tweet, or a Facebook posting, talking about organizing individuals to bring weapons to a certain protest. That would be, for us, fall within that area of criminal nexus.
So can you give us an example of a situation that has happened where that known criminal nexus was known to you and what you did about that, what you did with that information?
So there's one specific example would be the several protests in Berkeley where some of the protesters started to take over the freeways, and which would we would then be engaged by our law enforcement partners to help monitor that event, given the threat to public safety there, or in conjunction with that, in the lead up to it, groups that were going to join the protests actively calling for the mobilization of individuals with either sticks or other tools that could cause violent harm to show up at the demonstration.
So you were aware of this in advance because of the ability to research this on open source, or how did you come to know this information?
I would characterize it as the event is happening, more tweets or more social media is utilized by the actors involved, and then the nefarious actors, it starts to take a life of its own. The law enforcement on the ground is then sort of communicating that up to the channels. Then that's how we become aware of it.
So your involvement is essentially, if you will, in real time when an event is happening, and not in preparation in advance of it. Is that a fair statement?
It can be both, Senator. We're always on standby in support of our law enforcement partners. When we know that they may be mobilizing, we offer assistance in working with them to coordinate. At the same time, if we happen to stumble upon certain social media posts in the lead up to the event, then we will ensure that they are aware of those issues, and we have a team that looks at that situational awareness effort.
And do you work with the fusion centers, the gentleman to your immediate left, and trying to assess in advance what could be happening, what might be happening?
Yes, ma'am. How we break that up is, again, there's 6 across the state, 6 fusion centers. The STAC, the one I help lead, is the strategic center, the state level one. The other 5 are broken along basically the federal jurisdictions. They kind of look at the AOR that they're responsible for, and we help them in coordination do that.
You had mentioned there were certain civil liberties restrictions that help guide the work of STAC. Could you explain what those restrictions are?
I think what my remarks stated is that all of our actions are conducted within those civil liberties, and with that oversight and guidance from a robust chief counsel presence as well. So.
And you mentioned the situation at Berkeley. There were a couple instances at Berkeley where I'm assuming the intel was such that massive efforts were undertaken to avoid any kind of violence. And sort of the events kind of sputtered or never happened. I'm not quite sure, but that hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent. I'm wondering, do you believe that those events never materialized because of advance work, or was there something about the intel that was perhaps inaccurate?
So there's several events in Berkeley that happened. The ones that I'm thinking of are the ones that actually were quite destructive, and violence did occur. And so in those cases, I think every effort was made to protect the public and protect the protesters. And it's a tricky situation, and when you look at these events, they tend to be, they tend to start peacefully and then attract other more nefarious groups to them who want to drive their certain agendas. That seems to be this consistent theme, at least in the Berkeley effort.
So given your intel work, are you at a point where you feel that you're able to identify who these different groups are, the ones who are protesting, the ones who are inciting response, the ones who are providing the response? Would you say you have learned today, or you know today more than you knew before then, so that at least hopefully we would be able to be better prepared in the future? And is that as a result of both the fusion centers and the work that you do through the governor's office?
Yes, ma'am. So to answer that question, it tends to be a tricky problem and complicated in that when we identify a certain list, we do know of certain groups or individuals, and but given the sort of the nature of it, it continuously attracts new threat actors and who then participate. So to say that we have our arms around this, we're not there yet. I think we're doing a much better job, but we have more work to do.
Sir, can I comment on that? And back to Eli's
Please.
point. So as a National Fusion Center Association, we're a node of state and local operated centers. We're not a new agency. We're not an investigative body. So, for example, very fortunate that we have a close relationship in Orange County specifically with the University of California, Irvine, Cal State Fullerton. Their actions for preparation at a recent event that they just held on October 31st, the chief specifically told us the preparation and the information we developed from our Fusion Center network, knowing from incidents from Berkeley, knowing incidents from the University of Washington, Charlottesville, Florida, all these national events occurring, we're developing these best practices. What are some of the lessons learned that law enforcement identified? Who are some of these counter protesters? Who are some of these individuals attempting to cause a disturbance? And preparing that information helps us provide that information to our partners, incident commanders, while they're developing their event or incident action plans. And I know we were very fortunate that the chief from Cal State Fullerton PD identified the Fusion Center Network as a robust network to identify potential activity. Thanks.
Great. And on that note, you said developing best practices. Could you share with us what those best practices are and what you've learned?
Yeah, absolutely. And in many cases, the concern is for the public, but also for our law enforcement partners. We actually have a large response to some of these major events. What are some of the criminal activity that is occurring at these events? What type of tools, what type of weapons are we seeing? What type of indicators are prepared for? Is there black bloc potentially being involved? Are individuals bringing certain types of weapons or other insignia? What can better help our incident commanders on the field and our law enforcement partners on the ground in the event something does happen?
And what are the lessons that you've learned in the process?
Initial planning, early planning with all the law enforcement partners involved, utilizing the Fusion Center Network, utilizing Eli and myself and the rest of the California centers, for example, coordinate frequently on a routine basis. The National Fusion Center Network has essentially a national situation room where we share major events online in real time. Who's potentially involved in these events? Where is the next event occurring within the United States? What best practices can we share and we offer? And one is just initial planning by all partners involved. And I know specifically here in California and Orange County, we have a robust mutual aid program that supports one another.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm just curious, with respect to this aggregating data issue and the third-party applications, can you think of any specific examples where in hindsight you discovered that had you had the ability to aggregate data, your response would have come earlier and been more effective. Is that a fair question?
It's a fair question. So in many cases, the fusion centers are leveraged by our partners to develop, take information and potentially develop intelligence. That's what we're doing, taking information, vetting it out, and identifying intelligence. So in many cases, the only gauge we have for a special event that's occurring in our area is only online. So how do we vet individually? How do we go to specific posts? How do we look at specific event pages online, social media, networking, YouTube channels? How do we see that? And if we had a data aggregator to process that information, help us parcel that information to identify maybe potential, photos of weapons, individuals making, derogatory remarks, that would help us, identify the optic and the mood of the event itself, which our local commanders are always asking us. Potentially, how many folks are going to be involved, and is there a potential of violence? And if it's hard giving one specific post, where if we have the opportunity to aggregate all the data, we can probably provide even a clearer picture of potential activity.
And I was just wondering if you could think of a specific case where there was an incident, you responded, it was taken care of, but during the subsequent post-incident investigation,
Right.
you discovered data that had you had the ability to do your aggregating, you would have uncovered the incident, the plan, the motive ahead of time. Is that a fair question?
Yeah, and we had a recent event at Cal State Fullerton. An individual decided to start macing the group. Ends up happening. The only reason we found that online was because online we were watching a specific post online. We were following it. However, if we had identified earlier or through a data aggregator that somebody else was also recording it before the event had occurred, we had possibly directed those specific officers to that specific location before this individual decided to mace a handful of individuals.
I thought there probably were some examples out there. Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And with that, we will go on to our next panel. We have with us talking about pre-event planning and mitigation, and I think it's been stated, and I think we'd all agree that early planning and initial planning can be very helpful. I do know, though, that if I'm not mistaken, in Charlottesville, there was some early planning, but it was ignored by local law enforcement. And I'm wondering, with this next panel talks, if you could discuss the relationship with our local folks and what we can do better, if anything, to make sure that we are all working together, and that if threats and assessments are made, that information will be taken seriously, and we can hopefully avoid any of these events happening in the future. So with that, we have Chief George Hughes, the Assistant Vice President of Public Safety and the Chief of Police of California State University in San Luis Obispo. Go Mustangs. Dr. Ramin Talish, Assistant Vice Chancellor of Student Life and Leadership and Dean of Students at UC Irvine, a hotbed of some activity. I guess all our UCs and our CSUs are hotbeds of activity, but that's what higher education's supposed to do. Let's see how we're handling that. And we have Kristen Cook, who is the Director of Public Safety for the City of West Hollywood, and Captain Sergio Aloma, if I pronounced that right, who is with the LA Sheriff's Department and captain over at the West Hollywood Station, and Tara Lynch, Chief Counsel, and Kevin Persall, did I get that right? Orange Coast District State Park Superintendent 3, California Department of Parks and Recreation. And so with that, if we could start with Chief Hughes. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Madam Chair, for having me, and to our other committee members. Again, my name is George Hughes, and I'm the Chief of Police at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Yes, go Mustangs, thank you. And I'm also representing all of CSU's 23 campuses, law enforcement and chiefs. Our first priority in everything we do is to support the safety of our students for their success on our campuses. And as a public university, we also have a responsibility to uphold free speech and free expression, and provide an open forum for a variety of opinions, thoughts, and ideas, including those that are going to be offensive to others. That also means we cannot engage in censorship of any form. So it's a balancing act that I know that you've been discussing in this committee for several weeks now, and that we all are struggling with, especially on our college campuses. While we can't ensure that people won't be offended during these events, we can do everything within our powers to create a safe environment for everyone while they're engaging in the dialogue and debate we want them to and express their viewpoints, even if it's unpopular. I'm going to speak to our policies and practices that provide guidance to this issue, some of our best practices that we employ, and that has allowed us to appropriately balance these rights of free expression while ensuring a safe environment. But I will be focusing mainly on events on campuses, even though there are going to be a lot of same things we would do in our municipal areas on these events, but they are a little bit different on the college campuses. The approach for planning for creating a safe environment and mitigating risk for these events is very multifaceted. It requires large amounts of advanced planning, training, and communication, and what we call at Cal Poly a whole community approach. We take these measures to protect everyone. It's not just to protect the event speaker, but those who also decide to protest and those who may come to counter-protest. Events this past year that you discussed earlier have been a game changer for us here, especially on our college campuses. And we've had to step up our security measures and planning as a result. We suggest starting planning well in advance is the key to success of this type of operation and ensures a planning process that captures the entire campus community. For major events, time is usually on our side, and we need to use it wisely. Because rest assured, a lot of these extremist groups, they are also planning. And it is not uncommon to see them on our college campuses doing their own reconnaissance and their own intelligence on how we're handling these things. It's also important to plan throughout the year and prepare your campus, not when an event is being scheduled, but throughout the year, so you can predetermine the specific needs at event locations and campus facilities. Have basic safety plans already in place for each location that determines traffic, ingress and egress, safety zones, demonstration areas. So when it comes time for an event, you're already prepared for it, and then you just have to modify for the specific event. During this time, we also engage our campus and surrounding community early and often. We take a lot of time educating them, our campus, and the surrounding community on the specifics of what to expect for the event, and also the fundamentals of free speech. And a lot of times we're answering the question on why do we have to allow this speaker to be here. And I know we're not debating that today, but it's also a topic we have to talk about with our campus community. We do this through open forums and discussions with student groups and our activist groups. We engage them early and start building trust with them. So the day of the event, they already know us and we know them. We find there's a lot of fear and uncertainty on campuses leading up to these types of events, and this early and often communication to them assists in easing their anxiety and also ensuring them that they are supported, safe, and what their options are during this time so they know what to expect and what the ground rules are at the time of the event if they decide to attend or if they decide to protest. It's also very important that we have created and established partnerships early and often with our surrounding communities, especially our surrounding jurisdictions, because these take a ton of resources. They take more resources now than they ever have in the past. That is where our pre-established MOUs and mutual aid agreements come into play. A great example is what just happened in Berkeley at the last free speech week that they had. That took a tremendous amount of planning and effort from all of the entire county and state agencies to come together, and you can't do that without pre-existing agreements and relationships. It was very interesting to see Florida's Governor Scott declare a state of emergency last month before and in preparation for Richard Spencer's event there at University of Florida. This made state and federal resources available to the local jurisdictions in preparation and also indicated the amount and level of attention and planning that needed to be in response to this type of event that needs this type of to create this environment. A lot of times you'll see a state of emergency declared after a crisis, not before, so that was some forward thinking there. Training is also very important. University police departments must be highly professional and well trained. Although all our police officers are California Police post-certified sworn officers and receive all the same required trainings as any other peace officer in the state of California. We just can't place a police officer out there in the middle of these things without specialized training and crowd control techniques and the proper equipment. There is quite a difference in how to handle a peaceful protest, demonstration, or march versus crowd control for a violent, illegal protest, and also arrest techniques that are needed for nonviolent but illegal passive resistance techniques, such as human chains to block entrances and roadways that we are now seeing. Each needs to be handled differently, And if not appropriately, the police could be creating an actual flashpoint that is making the situation worse. Both the CSU and UC campuses all have highly trained special teams of officers that are activated and respond statewide during these events. Although we have these specialty teams, it's also important to train all of our individual officers on the campuses in these techniques, because activating these teams and getting them there sometimes takes time. And we all know that spontaneous protests and illegal demonstrations will pop up from time to time, and those officers needs to have the appropriate tools to handle them. It's also very important to know the legality of our actions. When does a demonstration or protest cross the line and become an unlawful assembly? The incident commander needs to know and provide appropriate notifications and warnings. Protect everyone's amendment rights, not illegally suppressing someone's right to lawfully demonstrate. We also need to have very strong and defendable campus policies. These are being tested now in courts on almost a monthly basis. Having appropriate time, place, and manner campus policies assist with planning, setting, and enforcing regulations to protect everyone and also defend or limit liability to the campuses when decisions are made to allow or not allow these events. A good policy will help us set the safety guidelines during an event as what can be brought into and can't, such as sticks with signs. It addresses where events can be held or not, ticketing, security charges, hours, campus versus non-campus entities renting our facilities. And it's very important that these policies treat each potential event consistently and are content neutral, or it will not be defendable. Now that the pre-planning is done, it's time for the logistical planning for the actual event. We have to do one central point of planning, and we utilize our emergency management office. We also utilize the standard ICS system. For these large events like you just saw at Berkeley, you need to use the Joint Incident Command system, because this is the only way to manage a massive amount of resources that come from the county or the entire state. Developing situational awareness and intelligence gathering will become one of the most important and effective actions before and during. I'm very glad that our intelligence community was here today and spoke before you. We do exactly what they say. We reach out to our local fusion center. We reach out to the entire intelligence community around us to try to identify potential groups beforehand. This helped us out in our last two big events that we had on our campus, which was Milo Yiannopoulos in January, and he also came back to Fullerton just last week. We used it when Lauren Southern came to campus, and each time we got information on who was coming and potentially what they were planning, so then we could plan on how we can react to them or proactively act to them. We picked them out of the crowd at Fullerton before they even walked onto campus, so they weren't able to cause a problem because of the intelligence reports that we received from these gentlemen. We cannot take for granted or assume that these individuals aren't going to come just because of what happened in Charlottesville. This past year was a game changer for us, and we now must be prepared for anything and everything. This is why we have so many police officers and barricades at all these events. A year ago, I didn't think I was going to have to put dump trucks blocking roadways, but now we do because vehicles are getting through and we know what they're doing. This has created a need for planning and protection inside and outside on several different layers. We are hearing that it's an overkill of police presence, but it's unfortunately not. It's what we need to successfully protect everyone, including the demonstrators and their right to protest. What we have seen this past year has become important to consider as threefold. Mitigating the illegal activities attempting to shut down an event. These are not protests. These are individuals actively attempting to shut down the speaker. These are normally outside groups that are hijacking a peaceful protest and turning it into an illegal, violent act of illegal activity and creating a mob mentality. This is exactly what occurred at Berkeley in February when Milo was there. We need, during these instances, to identify them early and arrest them and remove them from the crowd quickly. Many times what happens is at that point, then the demonstration turns back to being a peaceful protest once you have removed these few individuals. This also happened at Fullerton. We had the individuals that you had indicated that were pepper spraying people, throwing bottles and rocks. We went in and we extracted them. We didn't take anything from them. We extracted them, and then the protest turned peaceful. That's why Fullerton turned out the way it did. Second is the violence outside between competing groups that we are now dealing with, from protesters and counter-protesters. Here's where we need to try and create safety zones, limit what can be brought in and out of those areas, ticketing, wanding, and searching for weapons, and crowd control and arrest response teams. This is also where our time, place, and manner policies come in. If you don't have a good policy you can defend that allows you to do these things, it's going to be challenged and you're going to lose. And third is the trend we're seeing with the vehicles driving into the protests, which is requiring us to harden our areas more than we ever have. And this is not just during these events. We need to do this during our marches and demonstrations, where our students are demanding that we are keeping them safe. All of these, again, are why we reach out to our intelligence community. We didn't have to do it as much before, and now we do. And that's, again, why I do appreciate everything that you said earlier in this hearing. I think I'll let our other members discuss kind of the logistics of during an actual event and how we can mitigate some of these other things. I started to dabble into it, but I think I'll stop there and answer any questions you may have.
Just a couple easy ones. Could you describe for us an event you decided not to allow because of a threat of violence? And was there any pushback from the protagonists or any lawsuits because of that decision? Or is that something that you take into account more than just sort of as an intellectual exercise?
And we haven't had to not allow one yet on our campus or the ones that I have helped plan on the CSU campuses. I know it does occur, but we do a very strict security assessment for each one. And if we can identify a threat that obviously that we can point to is a real threat to the campus, allowing this individual or this group to come, then we would consider not allowing them to come. But we haven't had to yet. And again, that falls back into your time, place, and manner policy. If you have what your criteria are on how you are determining those security factors or what those threat indicators are and what they are, and you can point back to it, it's going to help you when you don't allow an individual to come. We see the trend of what Richard Spencer's doing of every time that you don't allow him to go somewhere, he sues that institution, and he's probably winning.
Last question for me is, you mentioned the Florida incident, and do you know why the governor decided to declare an state of emergency in advance? Should we be considering that here in California, and would something like that help cover some of the security costs of these events where the emergency is called and the federal involvement becomes part of the whole transaction?
I think it was a forethought by the governor there, understanding exactly what happened in Charlottesville and understanding that there was going to be a lot of attention there and is going to be a problem, that he did just for that reason, because the local jurisdictions probably needed that assistance at the state, maybe even federal level, that they couldn't afford, didn't have. Perhaps they didn't have proper MOUs in place beforehand, and they probably reached out and said, we're going to need help on this. I don't know the specifics to it. Some of the other individuals in the room might, but in my opinion, it was just the forethought on, we're going to take this seriously. We're not going to let this happen, and we're going to make sure they have every resource available to them to make sure that it's going to be a safe environment.
Do you think that's something we should consider here in California? Advanced states of emergency being proclaimed or being sought?
If the legislation around it is going to provide us the resources we need and help us with the funding, you had mentioned these things are costing hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it is taking so many bodies to do these things. If doing that is going to help us get those resources, then yes, I would support that.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Roth? No? All right. Our next witness is Dr. Talish, who is the Assistant Vice Chancellor of Student Life and Leadership and the Dean of Students at UC Irvine.
All right, thank you,
Good
Senator.
afternoon.
Thank you, Senator Jackson. Thank you to the committee. I do want to thank Chief Hughes. He did a great job from our sister CSU talking about highlighting the importance of collaboration and managing challenging events. I've been the Dean of Students at UC Irvine for 7+ years. I currently chair the system-wide group of our cohort of Deans of Students in the UC system and Assistant Vice Chancellors, and topics related to free speech and protest really dominate our agenda. And I bring this up because it has been helpful to have a cohort that we meet with on a regular basis. We meet 2 times together during the year, physically as well as on the phone, once every 2 months. And we talk about how we're dealing with situations, how we're grappling with the challenges, and what are some of the lessons we're learning, because it's an ongoing learning process when we're dealing with this. And we actually advocated to convene a summit in the UC, and we hosted it at UC Irvine in the summertime that brought together law enforcement, student affairs, legal, legal teams, communications folks, and we all had a chance to really talk and spend the day together to grapple again with the challenges that we're facing. On my campus, we have speakers on the left, the right, the middle of the political spectrum. We've had Milo twice. We've had student protests over fees. You name it, we've probably had it. And these are student protests, but oftentimes we also have community members that are using our public space as an opportunity to protest or voice their issues. And that, by far, for us, is a bigger challenge. And I'll speak to that a little bit later. Our approach at UC Irvine is grounded in something we call constructive engagement. It's a model that was introduced by our Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, Dr. Thomas Parham, years ago. Its foundation is built upon community safety being number one, care of our university facilities and minimizing disruption to the campus, personal engagement of students and other participants. And so I'm going to speak to some of that and the assumptions that we make about that. Number one is that we want to be proactively engaged with our students. And so we, in our office, in the Dean of Students office, we will meet with our student leaders right off the bat. Before end of the summer, fall quarter, we're meeting with our student leaders, as the chief mentioned, to develop relationships with our students. I speak to all students at our incoming orientations, and I speak about free speech. We put out campus messages. We have it on the front page of our handbook that we give out to all of our new students on the campus. We have an all-university leadership conference the first week of our fall quarter, and we take 200 students, and with that we spend about an hour's worth of free speech, basically workshop with our students, so that they understand the parameters, the issues, the complexity of what we're dealing with and what we're working with. Again, this is in a way to hopefully build relationships with our students in advance of the school year. We would try to facilitate free speech, not inhibit free speech. We're not about suppression. We're not about censorship. You know, we want to look at our students, and our students have rights. Our students have rights to have programs on our campus, and so they can host events, and that's what we'll try to help them and assist them in managing their events equally. At the same time, that does not mean that we are endorsing those events. We're not endorsing those speakers, and sometimes that's a little bit clouded in that we hear UC Irvine is hosting somebody and we want them on our campus. Not necessarily, if they're not adding value to the campus. But, however, our students do have a right to bring speakers to our campus. Just as our protesters have rights to protest. They have rights to protest in all kinds of forms. Sometimes that's boycotting an event. I think that's always the best protest, because some of these self-promoters that come to our campuses, they're just about self-promotion. They want to promote themselves. And so we talk to our students about saying, hey, why do you want to give them what they want? They're looking for that confrontation, that gotcha moment, that social media moment that they can play up, that they can get some notoriety for, and that they can get some more funding for and continue their road trip. And so one of the great methods of protest can be to just boycott the event. Now, certainly that's one of many. Students may decide to do silent protests, hand out flyers, do posters, do marches, do rallies, be vocal, et cetera, et cetera. You know, for us, it's about giving them an understanding what the policies are, what the laws are, what they shouldn't be going over. And generally speaking, our students are really, really effective and good in doing that and following those parameters. The one thing that they cannot do is shut down an event, and I think the chief alluded to that, or shut down a speaker. And that's something that's a difficult position to be in sometimes, because it puts us in confrontation. But that's the one thing that we need to be acting on and be held accountable to. So in other words, we're applying time, place, and manner in a content-neutral basis. And, you know, we are a business operation. We can't have people with bullhorns walking around classes and yelling into them anytime they want to. So we have restrictions on amplified sound. We have restrictions on some other things in terms of time, place, and manner. But as long as we're doing it in a content-neutral basis, that's what we're trying to do. Our philosophy of constructive engagement also is about intervening at a least intrusive level. And so what that means is, for us, our staff tries to intervene. Whether it's our event staff, our dean of student staff, our student life staff, we will try to intervene first and kind of push law enforcement back if it makes sense. And so we will be front and center. But we also have something called mutual permeable boundaries. Lots of big words. But what it basically means is that we're going to be up there front. But if it's a campus safety issue, or some things are going awry, or there are non-students there that don't really care who the dean of students is, they don't really care about student conduct or student policies, then we're going to have to elevate it to having law enforcement take a more front and center role. And so we work very closely, and so that leads to collaboration. We're continuously working with our friends in PD, with our colleagues in event services, with our colleagues trying to find out what's going on, what's the buzz out there with the student body, what's the buzz maybe in the community, as PD brings intelligence to the forefront. And so we have meetings multiple times depending on what type of event it is. Sometimes we may not be afforded that time to have multiple meetings, but we certainly will meet in advance to figure out how are we discussing the venue, anticipating issues, problem solving, anticipating safety planning, you name it. Failure to prepare is preparing to fail. I think John Wooden used that. And so what we're trying to do really is prepare as best as possible. Now with that, we know that we're dealing with uncontrollable variables. We have variables that we cannot control. And so even though we may be prepared in amazing ways, it's a guarantee that we don't know exactly what's going to happen on the day of. And so that's, I think, the issue that we're all confronted with. I would just want to point out, though, I think most of the time our students are fantastic in that they know the parameters that they can push, and they stop when they're about to go over the edge. Really, the challenge for us is dealing with the community element most of the time, and that individuals or groups that don't care about student conduct on the outside, they're the difficult ones, and they bring an element that really, as a dean of students, is a difficult one to deal with sometimes, because we don't have those relationships and they don't have that care of our community the same way. But certainly we still even try to educate our students to that fact as well, so they should not fall into that trap of being manipulated or kind of baited into something, and they have to show a lot of self-discipline with that. So again, constructive engagement for us is our model. We use that. I have lots of examples and things like that, but we really try to train our staff on that. That's the approach that we take behind the scenes. We try to utilize case studies, debrief about events, take on the roles, maybe as observers, as student supporters, as engagers in the situation, and work our best way in dealing with situation as is. So with that, I think I'll take any questions.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. The prior speaker, Chief Hughes, mentioned that the biggest challenge sometimes is people from the outside of the community. And while it sounds like you've done a pretty good job with your folks inside, I'm somewhat aware, I think at Irvine there have been some issues with the BDS movement. And my understanding is some of that is not internal. How do you address external community or people from outside the school coming in and attempting to disrupt, if you will? And how do you deal with that?
Well, I think we're still implementing the same model. I mean, in an ideal world, we will still confront behavior. If we see somebody that's bringing in a huge flagpole, we're going to ask them to take that away. Or, we have a policy on our campus that limits the size of a flagpole. So we'll try to engage the community members in the same ways in which we would engage students. But it is more challenging because they may have their own agenda there. They may think that they know their rights. I had an individual a couple weeks ago say to me that I have free speech right. I can use this bullhorn. You don't know what you're talking about. Called me an expletive. And I said, well, you don't understand amplified sound in time, place, and manner, obviously. And so then I called my officer friend over here, and they had to deal with them. So, those are difficult situations, obviously. We try not to escalate those situations. Again, it's about planning. If we catch wind that there are elements from the outside community coming onto our campus to inflame, we'll watch the events. We'll be observers to it. We will confront on occasion. Oftentimes there are community members that will listen as well. They will say, okay, I now know that I can't do this or I can't do that. We do sometimes get allegations of harassment, and so then we will investigate that. We may hand it over to police if it's a law enforcement issue. If it's student on student, we will deal with it through a student conduct lens. And then that takes investigation, making sure that we're detailing the facts, making sure we're being thorough about our process and due process. And making sure we get to the real issues. Because sometimes what you read about in the newspapers about things that go on at UC Irvine or Cal State Fullerton or wherever else is not really the reality of what's happening on the ground. And it's again, an effort being made to kind of lobby for whatever issue is on the outside. So.
And then have you ever denied an event? Have you ever refused to allow a speaker or a protest or anything of that sort?
I don't remember ever denying it.
Okay. And now, I wonder how the CSUs rather, work together on their time, place, and manner policies, which I understand that have to be neutral and better to have them well in advance of the event so no one can accuse you of reshaping them for this particular event. But I know that there are some campuses like Pierce College, for example, which is being investigated by the federal government because of their speech policies. Is this something you've discussed? Is this something which you are constantly reviewing in order to hopefully protect against those allegations being made in lawsuits filed?
Yeah, I think that I can't speak for the community college system, but I think this is something that has certainly probably trickling down. In other words, the UC, I think most of our campuses have our policies in place. I think Cal State's, this hasn't maybe been as much of an issue, but it's becoming an issue, and so they're working on theirs. And community colleges, again, I can't speak to that. I know of the Pierce incident, but in terms of a system-wide approach, not necessarily, though I think I'm seeing more educators wanting to do things like that. I was asked recently at a conference to maybe convene a group of deans of students for UC and Cal States and community colleges as a step towards that, so that we're all dealing with challenges in these roles. And I guess they look at me as the older person in this role. So they're saying, go ahead and why don't you convene a summit maybe at UC Irvine or somewhere else and bring these folks together. So we may end up doing that. We have no issues with sharing anything, really. I mean, I'll share our constructive engagement document with the group here as well.
Thank you, Senator Roth. Thank you very much. And let's move now to what some of our local communities are doing. And we have Kristen Cook, who is the Director of Public Safety for the City of West Hollywood, and Captain Sergio Aloma, West Hollywood Station of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. Good afternoon, and I'm glad we came to our first woman representative here on this important issue, and perhaps someday we'll have more women on the dais and talking about public safety and in leadership positions in these august institutions. But glad to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And good afternoon, Senator Roth and staff as well. Thank you for having us here today. I am Kristen Cook, Public Safety Director for the City of West Hollywood. With me is West Hollywood Sheriff Station Captain Sergio Aloma of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, who provides all law enforcement services for the city. Each year, the City of West Hollywood permits several special events and hosts major events such as Halloween Carnival and Los Angeles Pride. Pre-planning for these events include representatives from city departments and also our partner agencies such as the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, the Los Angeles County Fire Department, the Los Angeles County EMS Agency, and area hospitals, among others. The goal of our event planning team is to prepare an event action plan that provides for a safe event while mitigating impacts such as noise and traffic, among others, to the surrounding neighborhood. This multidisciplinary team provides all law enforcement and life safety services needed during our events and operates out of a unified command post. At Halloween and Pride, where the city plays host to tens of thousands of visitors, this also includes on-site medical tents for patient care. At the city's planned events, we do see regular protesters, and our sheriff's personnel make contact with these groups ahead of time whenever possible. The event planning team designates a specific location for their demonstrations with barricades. Now, with the event of vehicles and pedestrians being close together, they're generally water barricades, and provides sheriff's personnel standing by if needed. Any planned demonstrations that include stages or other building elements are handled through the city's special event permit process and also through our building and safety office. For unplanned events such as protests or impromptu free speech events, the same planning team convenes as quickly as possible to ensure the safety of the community, the safety of the demonstrators, and again, to mitigate impacts to the surrounding area whenever possible. Generally, the groups who have demonstrated in West Hollywood have a spokesperson who is willing to work with law enforcement out of our West Hollywood Sheriff Station and to come together to agree upon designated protest areas or street closures where everybody is going to park and other items. These demonstrations are typically not permitted events. West Hollywood Sheriff Station personnel are deployed along with the Los Angeles County Fire Department personnel to provide a safe environment, and we work collaboratively to help monitor the crowd. Captain Aloma here today is our expert on the law enforcement side of this, and we're happy to answer any questions that committee members may have.
Thank you very much, and I'll look forward to hearing from the captain and then perhaps have some questions for both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, for having me here today. As Kristen mentioned, I am the captain of the West Hollywood Sheriff Station. We provide law enforcement services for the city of West Hollywood on a contractual basis. However, although we are a small station, the city of West Hollywood has approximately 35,000 residents that we provide general law enforcement services for. For some of the large events that Kristen has mentioned, LA Pride every June, Halloween Carnival, which happens obviously on Halloween night. These events are events that have been occurring in the city of West Hollywood for over 3 decades. So as a result, and the fact that they happen every year, we have, through trial and error and through our experiences, been able to manage and police those events with our other law enforcement partners, as well as our other public safety partners, LA County Fire Department, and members of the city staff. We rely heavily, because we are a relatively small station, we rely heavily on the larger Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. We have approximately 18,000 employees with the Sheriff's Department that we can draw from, and the various units within the Sheriff's Department that we collaborate with. Every year, pre-planning occurs for every one of these pre-planned events months ahead of time. We rely heavily on the Sheriff's Department's Emergency Operations Bureau, which coordinates various assets and resources from within the department, which include helicopters from our Aero Bureau, our arson explosives detail, our bomb squad, our mounted enforcement detail, our emergency response teams, our SWAT elements, our Criminal Intelligence Bureau, which also includes an element of a dignitary protection unit should we have advance notice that elected officials or other dignitaries will be in attendance at these events. We also provide a crime analysis unit that does a lot of the pre-planning as it relates to open source information, where they may monitor various social media platforms, where they will provide us with information ahead of time. If we have any information that protesters or counter-protesters will be at the event, we obviously plan for those groups as well. For example, this past Halloween, that came on the heels of the October 1st incident in Las Vegas with the active shooter there that changed our response. Also, the morning of Halloween, if you recall, we had the incident in New York City in Lower Manhattan, the terrorist event. So as those events occur, we then meet as quickly as possible, and if we have to redeploy resources or request additional resources, we're able to do so pretty quickly. So those are just some of the things that we do as it relates to pre-event planning. This year at Halloween, we did have some protesters, very small groups generally. The Westboro Baptist Church and a small group from Antifa were within the footprint of our event. We generally will identify those individuals as quickly as possible. We will deploy resources to the area just to monitor them. They obviously have their right to their First Amendment free speech. We will identify organizers and make contact with them to kind of get some intelligence and see how long they're going to be there, what their intentions are, and so forth. And then we just generally deploy and react depending on what their posture is and the safety of the event itself in general.
So in that regard, when you say to get a sense of what they're doing, do you approach them? Do you confront them, people in uniform, ask them what their purpose is? Could you give us some specific things that you do to kind of keep control of a crowd, to also keep weapons out of an event, kind of control the movement of people, monitoring in real time? You know, these are obviously the people from the Westboro Church aren't there to join in on Gay Pride Parade Day. What kinds of things specifically do you do?
Well, we have both elements of obviously uniformed, a large element of uniformed officers on foot, on horseback, and in vehicles. But we also have an element of plainclothes officers that are dispersed amongst the crowd within the footprint of the event. So it just kind of depends on what their posture is and what they're doing, how many of them are within the footprint of the event. We'll monitor their activities, but we generally, our practices are that we will send a uniformed supervisor to approach them, identify an organizer, and make contact with them. Let them know that we are certainly there to protect them and their rights to free speech. However, we have at times, we also have to let them know that our resources may be limited and we may not be able to keep a constant eye on them, and we may not be able to be there with them 100% of the time to protect them from counter-protesters. So we establish that dialogue with them early on, as early as possible.
And how is it you recognize these people? Again, is this the intel that comes from the Fusion Center and other intelligence that you rely upon, or is it your own, or how does that work?
We have, at our co-located command post, we have a group of crime analysts, as well as our Criminal Intelligence Bureau from the Sheriff's Department that are monitoring social media platforms in the days leading up to the event and, of course, the day of the event. So as they gain intelligence, they will provide that to the command staff. We also have a helicopter that provides downlink to our command post. So we're actually able to see, have eyes on from the command post, so that as command staff needs to make decisions depending on the size and the number of protesters, counter-protesters, things like that, we could make those decisions real time with video provided to us at our command post.
And specifically to the city of West Hollywood, are you seeing an increase in confrontations, an increase in demonstrations, or anything related to some of the key kind of characteristics of the population there? People coming in from outside, or seeing a heightened level of confrontation, I think would probably be the politest way to put it.
We're definitely seeing what we lovingly call a heightened state of lack of manners among people. We are seeing kind of the same groups. I've worked for the city almost 20 years now, and it generally is similar groups of people over the years. But there's an angst in the groups on both sides that is new, I'd say, over the last year and a half. We did have one incident. It was an impromptu demonstration at Crescent Heights in Santa Monica, where the group protesting the protesters spit on one of the protesters, if you could follow that. And so that was new for us, for it to turn so confrontational. But again, we are seeing generally the same people, but people are a little more on edge than I've seen in my career with the city.
Thank you. Nope, Senator Roth. Thank you, and appreciate that assessment of how you try to monitor things. Again, that is under the mitigation aspect, is to diffuse a situation in advance. Obviously, that's always the better way to do it. When you have, last question, when you have events, do you limit what people can carry, so that they're the ability to turn a placard into a sword is reduced? Is that something that West Hollywood does? And
so for Halloween, we do advertise prohibited materials that you can bring. Obviously, that's a celebration, not a protest, although it includes protests. For protest marchers, we haven't necessarily taken away signs from people, but law enforcement's definitely standing by and watching to see how those signs are being used. Are they being held? Are they being waved at somebody's face? And then we would be stepping in at that point. But for Halloween or Pride, we have a long list of banned items.
thank you very much. Next, we have Tara Lynch, Chief Counsel with Kevin Pearsall, Orange County District State Park Superintendent, talking to us about how things are going in the parks with the Department of Parks and Recreation. It seems like using some of your facilities for protests is kind of a logical, great American tradition. How's that going?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair Jackson and Senator Roth and staff. My name is Tara Lynch, and I'm the Chief Counsel of California State Parks, and Superintendent Pearsall and I are very honored to be here representing the department. California State Parks, as you know, is responsible for the management and operation of the state park system, which includes 280 different park units ranging from beaches to mountains to museums to off-highway vehicle parks, etc. The mission of the department is to provide for the health, inspiration, and education of the people of California by helping to preserve the state's extraordinary biological diversity, protecting its most valued natural and cultural resources, and creating opportunities for high-quality outdoor recreation. So how does state parks and First Amendment go together? As you stated, Senator Jackson, the courts have ruled that parks are quintessential public forums that are traditionally open to all manner of First Amendment activities. Now, that doesn't mean that all areas within the state park system are automatically traditional public forums. I mean, if we have a natural preserve, you know, you wouldn't necessarily allow the public to hold a big event there. So our inquiry always is, has that area of the park unit in question been previously used for purposes of assembly, communicating thoughts between citizens, and discussing public questions? Again, museum, wildernesses, preserves may not be traditional public forums. State Parks, as you can imagine, has a number of large events or special events in those in our parks, and those can be anything from the family reunion to a wedding to a big surfing competition to a marathon to a free speech event. State Parks permits these activities with what we call a special event permit. And that's because these events may require use or exclusive use of an area within a park. It may require additional staffing, or it may be different than the general public use of that area of the park. When we issue the special event permits, as everyone else has been saying here, we have to, you know, we can only restrict based on time, place, and manner. And that time, place, and manner restrictions have to be content neutral. Place, and manner, you know, the first thing we look at is, place. And again, I'm referring back to, you know, has the area of the park unit in question been used for special events before? If we're allowing weddings, if we're allowing surfing competitions, et cetera, to be there, we would also allow First Amendment protected speech to occur there. Time, we would, you know, keeping in consideration the public's use of the park, campsites, we're going to make restrictions based on time. So we're not, you know, having events after 10 p.m. when people, you know, might be sleeping in their camps. And manner would be things like amplified sound. Again, if we're going to allow a wedding to have amplified sound, we're going to have to allow a First Amendment activity to have the same type of amplified sound. The key is just to apply the time, place, and manner restrictions equally without considering the content of the activity or the speech. When a special event permit request comes in, the district superintendent or the sector superintendent works with the legal office to apply those time, place, and manner of restrictions reasonably and fairly across all the different permit events. So at that point, I'd like to turn it over to Superintendent Pearsall, who's going to talk about how he engages with the permittees or the people requesting the permits, and then the consulting with the legal office.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator, and good afternoon. I have a feeling, I think you were asking over there just recently, just to give you a little bit of a background, we do have over 500 sworn peace officers for California State Park System that are spread throughout the state. Depending on the demographics and the nature of activity and recreational activity per park depends on how many officers are assigned for those specific locations. kind of going to sound very redundant as my fellow public safety agencies before me, which I think is a positive thing. We have the same kind of pre-planning and real-time planning in reference to permitting process, emergency and incident action plans, allied agency pre-designated response plans, which in Orange County are kind of called a Code Charlie, for mutual aid and coordinated through, which is coordinated through the Sheriff's Department. We work very closely with local agencies and federal agencies for any event and threat assessment prior to the event. The intelligence is gathered. OCAIAC is a big asset for us. In particular, we had a recent freedom speech or First Amendment speech in March at Huntington Beach. That was one of really our first experiences with something that didn't entail a surf event or a marathon and things of that nature. It was identified, which was a positive element to our special event process, as a march, i.e. a walk. So we were able to kind of time, place, and manner, put them in a specific place within that park, have their time and their basically the ingress and egress elements of it in place so that it benefited the public for public safety elements that participated. We have a fantastic communication set up with allied agencies, police, fire, sheriff's department, federal agencies that really pre-designate response plans for us that make it all worthwhile. Similar to the sheriff's department in Los Angeles mentioned, we have mounted police, K9 elements, and all the benefits to not necessarily neutralize, for lack of a better word, control or kind of give the ambiance that there is a large element of public safety at the event to make the public feel comfortable that whether or not something happens or doesn't happen, there is a huge comfort in public safety surrounding the event in particular. Basically, I think that's about it, unless you have any questions.
Yes, given the jurisdictions over which you have control can be anywhere from a beach to a wilderness to a park, do you have different time, place, and manner requirements, or is it same one basically that's sort of content neutral that you use, whether it's a beach, whether it's a hike, whether it's a state park? How about right outside the Capitol? We see a lot of demonstrations, most of them very peaceful, just the occasional one that isn't. Do you have different sets of rules and regulations depending, or is it one basic set of rules?
We try to make it one basic set of rules, just to be fair and consistent throughout the department. But as you say, we do have to keep in mind the location and the type of park it is in. So, I mean, I'm just throwing out as an example, Hearst Castle. The castle sits on top of the hill. We don't allow, free speech events up there. I wouldn't think a protester would really want a free speech event up there because, a bus takes you up there. It's a very organized tour that participants go on. However, we do allow free speech activities to occur at the visitor center, which is below, and anyone can park in the parking lot and go to the visitor center. So, just keeping in mind the particulars of the park unit, we do try to be consistent in applying the time, place, and manner restrictions.
I have a very strong curiosity and interest in the use of unmanned aerial or aircraft, drones. Do you have any restrictions on the use of drones in these events? If someone wanted to videotape or somehow memorialize a demonstration, are you able to, do you attempt to control what's going on above the ground as well, and how do you go about doing that?
So State Parks has a general, across the state, and it doesn't have to do with any special event. Drones are allowed unless they're not allowed pursuant to a state park superintendent order. And things we consider are, again, the nature of the park unit. If it's a crowded, area where maybe people would be used to having a drone fly above them, they might be allowed, versus if you're in a natural or cultural preserve where it could affect habitat or species, we're not going to allow it there. So the same would be applied with a special event permit. Again, I think the superintendent, is going to work with the permittee to allow the event and to not look at the content of the speech. So if drones are otherwise allowed, we would allow it. If they're not, we're not going to.
So they are not, at least from your perspective, viewed as something that could present a danger, or?
They absolutely, I believe, can present a danger. I mean, we also follow the FAA laws and rules when it comes to that. I don't know if you have any particular experience.
What we really kind of, as a superintendent of some specific parks, when it comes to special events and the size and the caliber of the event and the type of the event, one of the main emphases we do is we don't necessarily stop all elements of drones, but limit how many drones. So at that point, it becomes a first come, first serve type basis of how many drones we'll allow. Depending, again, it's case by case on the type of events. And one of the unique things, and I'm sure everybody can say that for each jurisdiction they're within, both with state parks in particular, we have so many diverse, different opportunities that come to us or that that participate within the parks. It really is kind of a challenge for us to determine what can and cannot occur and be allowed during the particular events.
Well, I'm kind of curious about drones because they have great potential, but there have been incidents, for example, during I think it was a gay pride parade up in Seattle where a drone crashed and knocked an observer unconscious, and I think she just sued and won a fairly substantial recovery. And just wondering if drones and the use of them and the weaponization of them, which we know is a potential, is something that you consider in your planning or in your permitting process. And maybe we can do that when we're done with all the questions. But I do have a particular interest in this very fascinating technology, which has great potential and also sort of some rather scary potential, side effects. I'd like to ask the whole panel, we talk about planning and coordination, and it makes these events manageable and to an extent predictable, assuring the folks from the Westboro Church that their safety can't necessarily be assured. Maybe they don't want to be out there screaming things to 5,000 people who disagree with them. But, things don't always go according to plan. And so I would be very interested in what you've experienced at these events, which did not go to, were not anticipated, and which created some challenges for you, particularly experiences that have led you to reevaluate and perhaps reestablish your various protocols, et cetera.
Don't all go in once, right?
Yeah.
Just dive right in.
We are seeing more and more, obviously, of protests and counter-protests and violence out in the crowds. I think we're all challenged with that a little bit. For us, we're very hesitant to put a line of officers in between the two groups, because then a lot of times the focus turns on law enforcement and the hatred is pointed towards them instead of letting the two groups debate. But we do keep a close eye on it. Sometimes we do it through video in our, we videotape these things and watch them in our incident command post, and we see one starting to turn violent. That's when your extraction team needs to go in and extract the individual who committed the crime of assault at that point, and then get them out of the area, and then diffuse the situation very quickly. So a lot of very close monitoring. I think that's what the Sheriff's Department's doing when they have their uniformed officers there, keeping a close eye on it, waiting for something to possibly turn bad. But that's kind of where we're headed with it. I think as we talk about when we get into the operational aspect from the other panel, they might discuss that some also, but that's how we handle it.
I'm assuming, and if you would, I'm assuming, that nothing is scripted, that things aren't necessarily going to go in direction A, which is what you planned for, but instead in direction G. How do you address those problems when they arise? Who's in charge? Who makes the call?
Well, usually we have, in our pre-event planning, we have talked about a protocol in terms of who would be the, let's say, on our campus, who would be the student affairs representative that's working with our police representative, and who's that point of contact. And so that would be the direct communication being made then as to, okay, this situation is getting out of hand, or, oh, we're going to call in extra resources, and usually we will step down and let law enforcement take the lead when it's getting to that stage or level. You know, we learned some things from, Milo 1, I'll call it. The first time around, we had hundreds of people from off campus on our campus, and they were outside because the venue was too small. And then we had students that started to gather and started to protest as well. And our officers at the beginning were just facing our students. And so our students were like, hey, why are you looking just our way? And so I think we now put it as a part of the training for the officers. They've implemented, where they would have people positioned in both directions, for instance. So that was a learning moment. Another one would be that we had some instances where people were making claims that they were either being pushed or touched, or in the heat of their arguments with maybe students going back and forth or a community member going back and forth. And then people were wanting to maybe file a complaint. And we did not have necessarily an officer available to handle that complaint at that moment. And that was rather frustrating for the people that were involved in terms of wanting to express their concerns. And so, I think now we think about, okay, do we have someone that's going to handle complaints at the moment, at the event themselves, are available and ready to do it? And that's going to be one of the things they're going to focus on if things get out of hand. And so those are like a few kind of small little ripple lessons, but things that we learned, obviously, in our debrief of the event after that occasion. So, and we try to debrief almost every event.
Any other thoughts?
So for us in West Hollywood, we say that our events are predictably unpredictable. We try to brainstorm scenarios ahead of time, and we think of 20, and it's the 21st one that happens that day. And I think for us, we really focus on the what ifs, but we also focus on building that team ahead of time. And those decisions are made out of our unified command post. So everybody in that room, they know each other well. We've done other events together. And so then you can kind of lean and trust on each other when those decisions are being made. And then all of the incident commanders from the various agencies are in the same room, making that collaborative decision together.
Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Just touch on what Kristen already mentioned. We as someone else mentioned in the room, we adhere to the ICS system as well. So there's a very defined chain of command within our co-located command posts with our various different partners from the different law enforcement agencies, fire and city. So our chain of command is pretty clearly defined where the decisions are made from our command post as things happen during the event, even if they are spontaneous. The incident commander is the ultimate decision maker as to how we're going to handle spontaneous events as they occur, and how we're going to deploy or redeploy resources to handle those.
Great. Thank you. All right, Senator Roth. No? Okay. He listens so well, absorbing it all. Thank you. But I think, there's so much to learn on these situations. And I wonder, because what Senator Roth and I, are, I think, interested in is what can or should we consider as legislation to be helpful. And one of the thoughts that comes to my mind is clearly there are some best practices that have been developed and evolved, and I wonder, are these things that we would even need to put into any kind of statute, or are they being pursued by virtually every local jurisdiction? Again, I'm concerned because in Charlottesville they kind of ignored, it didn't appear that a lot of the recommendations that were made in the advanced planning were actually followed. And we can always second guess things. Hindsight's, of course, always 20/20. But I wonder, would you recommend, do you think that the state could do more or could set forth and require certain procedures be followed, certain criteria be necessary in anticipating and going forward as to how we deal with these events. Any thoughts there? And if not, to the third panel, if you could speak to that as well, would be helpful. Anyway, think about it. I think we'll have some time afterwards, but I think that what we're looking for is what we can do to be helpful. So with that, let's go to our third and final panel, which is response and recovery. And we have Lieutenant Mark Littlestone with the University Police Department at UCLA. Been a very busy day there so far. We have Acting Commissioner Warren Stanley and Assistant Commissioner Scott Silsby, with the Highway Patrol. We have Mark Pazin, who is the Chief Law Enforcement Branch of the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, and Major General David Baldwin, Adjunct General with the California Military Department, with whom I took a ride in a helicopter 4 weeks ago, which led to a slip disc that I suffered. I need to talk to you about a little smoother ride in those choppers.
I brought my lawyer.
I want to speak to him. All right. With that, let's start with Lieutenant Littlestone. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator Roth. It's my pleasure to be here, speaking on behalf of the UCLA Police Department and Chief Tony Lee. In the 27 years I've worked for the UCLA Police Department and serve in the other 9 campuses of the University of California, I've not seen a time that campus protests have been as violent as they have been in recent years. I've traveled during my time to 9 of the 10 UC campuses and participated in many crowd management and crowd control events, to include concerts, sporting events, protests, regents meetings, and other events where police services are required. I've had the opportunity, if you want to call it that, to be present for divestment protests as a UC Berkeley student in the late 80s, to working as an officer during People's Park construction in 1991, the Los Angeles riots in 92, to working Ben Shapiro Monday night at UCLA. I'd like to cover a few topics during my time here, and they cover planning and preparation, as we've discussed. I'll try not to reiterate what we've heard, but planning for these controversial events, some of the strategies and tactics for responding to them, de-escalation, cost recovery, and some of the challenges that we face. We do all of this with the intent to support the educational mission of the university. These events vary widely, and each one is unique. With that being said, there is much that our department can do and has done in an effort to combat this violence, and many changes and improvements in tactics and coordination have occurred. To address the planning and response to a potentially controversial event, the police department works in conjunction with many of our partners here, to include representatives from the student organizations, our Office of Student Organizations, Leadership and Engagement, Legal Affairs, the Chancellor's Office, venue staff, campus and local fire departments, parking and transportation, contract security, local law enforcement, and mutual aid agencies. The sooner we know the who, what, where, and when, we can start the planning process and generate, as you've heard, an event action plan. That covers an expected timeline, the deployment of assigned personnel, the event objectives, strategies, and tactics. We do utilize the incident command system, and when necessary, working with other agencies, a unified command structure. One other aspect to the planning process is, as we've mentioned, the gathering of information related to the speaker or the focus of the event. We do the similar and reaching out to other agencies or departments who have hosted or worked similar forums or speakers, ask about their experiences. We talk to event organizers about their intentions and their expectations for the event, discuss options with venue staff, and if the speaker has their own staff or security, we'll talk to them as well. Briefings are held to make sure that those on hand are clear on the mission, the objectives, the strategies, and the tactics in order to ensure a safe event, protect the rights of those assembled, maintain order, and restore order if necessary. As the incident or the event continues, our strategies may vary from containment to isolation of disruptive elements, dispersal, and/or restoration of order. Contingency planning is a must, but due to the nature of some of the events and incidents, factors beyond our control, the number of attendees or protesters being unknown may lead to understaffing or under-equipping. I will say that no matter the size of our force deployed, it's imperative from the incident commander down to the officer on a post or a skirmish line that they are aware of the plan, the rules of engagement, and an awareness of how a police response affects a crowd. Our officers are trained in reasonable and appropriate uses of force, taking into account the nature, the number, and the behavior of the crowd or the individual. We want to be cognizant of de-escalation techniques and communicate with identified leaders of groups to minimize our physical engagement with the crowd. To address some of these concerns, the UC police departments have created and maintain a system-wide response team, or SRT, similar to the Cal State's CROUP. This consists of officers at the individual UC police departments that have extra training in crowd management and crowd control, disentanglement, which is the process of removing protesters from devices like pipes, barrels, chains, and locks, like those seen blocking freeways and other events, and other less lethal options. The greater the potential for crowd control, the more officers on the SRT are requested to staff these events. Although staffing concerns and the tempo of events statewide affect the availability of the UC to staff events with our own officers or those on SRT. As a consequence, we may rely on mutual aid agreements with neighboring law enforcement agencies and either have them on standby or have them present at an event. One important aspect is to have enough staffing for the event to function absent a protest or civil disobedience, and the other is to have enough staffing to respond effectively to incidents occurring before, during, or after the event. It is in this area that a lack of information relating to attendees or protesters becomes problematic, and I've seen staffing for events vary with hundreds of officers to those with only a few dozen. An appropriate and measured response to civil disobedience or violence is necessary, and the sooner action is taken to mitigate unlawful and disruptive activity, the sooner order can be restored. Failure to do so puts people, both civilians and officers, at risk and property, and may allow a small situation to grow, which then necessitates a larger response. This requires constant monitoring, to include social media, of the event and the crowd, and the strategic placement of staff and equipment so they can respond quickly. We designate response teams for this purpose and equip them as appropriate for mission. However, challenges arise when events are held at night, lighting is poor, screening for weapons or dangerous items is often sporadic or ineffective due to logistical concerns, communications are affected when the noise level rises, and officers working a venue they have never been to before all contribute to inefficiencies in response. Command and control issues also arise when departments are intermixed or on different radio channels. Some of these issues can be addressed by equipment purchases, and the UC has made some of these, but changing attitudes and the drive of those intent on attending public spaces with homemade or other weapons and an attitude towards fighting those they disagree with is a bigger issue not solved with equipment. We can communicate a list of items that are banned, but finding them, confiscating them, or arresting those who carry them is often a challenge. Our campuses are open public spaces meant for collaboration and the free flow of information and people, but these same spaces pose issues when we attempt to establish perimeters, control access, and minimize the disruption to other businesses on a congested campus. Training is often looked to in order to address these issues, and that's an area in which we're proud to associate ourselves with our neighboring agencies and the Highway Patrol. We have held and continue to plan exercises with our partner agencies and participate in joint training with the CHP for our SRT. As incidents occur across the state, the country, and the world, we are in contact with individuals that have information we can learn from. As technology changes, we try to adapt but are often behind the curve due to research, procurement, and cost challenges. The related issue and one we struggle with is the cost associated with protecting and staffing these events. Some of the costs are borne by the individual departments and others by the sponsoring organization or department, but as I'm sure you're well aware, security is not inexpensive. Overtime, travel, equipment, food, and lodging are often required for these events and often without a lot of time to plan. It's also not possible to sustain repeated deployments either for a long event or several in rapid succession without depleting the physical and mental ability of officers on the line to work effectively. Not only is this a concern for the event at the time, but the regular assignments that they may be pulled from to work such an event. I've taken much of my time addressing our planning process for planned events, but the same challenges also present themselves and many more when we are confronted with an unplanned event like a celebration of a sports championship or a party that's gotten out of hand and people want to occupy a space or a street and celebrate. I know that's not the focus per se of this panel, but any recommendations likely to address planned events will impact the unplanned ones as well. I hope this sheds some light on the processes we undertake and the challenges we face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you wouldn't mind, you certainly have had your share over the years of being involved with events that both have gotten out of hand and which haven't, that might have. And I'd like you just to take, for example, just this past week, there was an event at UCLA with someone who has been somewhat controversial, and I know when he was up at Berkeley, there was an enormous expense associated with his speaking. But if I'm not mistaken, the event went fairly smoothly.
Very smoothly.
Could you give us your insights into why that happened, and I'm assuming it was also a lot less costly to provide that protection both for the speaker and for those who disagree with him.
The costs are still being generated and tallied as we speak, but we staffed that event with 77 officers. And I'm going to say, are lucky on any event that nothing happens. And we can look at that in the future and say, well, 77 was great, and use that number for another event. Or we could say that 300 should have been there. It's sometimes hard to tell, and part of this goes to the information and the intelligence gathered from that information prior to that indicated to us that there weren't going to be too many protesters present. Some of that is social media searching, asking the organizers what they've heard, the speaker themselves if they've gotten threats, etc. That's the threat assessment process that we go through prior to. Part of it and the challenges we had, the number of the officers that we came up with for this particular event are also predicated on other events occurring across the state. We sent officers to San Francisco for a Regents meeting. We have an event in Irvine that they're asking for folks. We have the UCLA-USC bonfire this week, so we can't pull from everywhere sometimes to get the numbers that we'd like. And of course, the university and the department is hesitant to spend more money than we know we can get back from departments, and much of that is borne by the organization itself and our department. So some of that is due to the strategies and the tactics of placing officers, as we've discussed, in key locations, so people that are coming to the events see a force. We don't want to be overbearing, we don't want to be heavy-handed, but we want to be present, and they need to know that we are ready to respond, whether that's an officer that has a helmet nearby or a baton, or they're in what we may call riot gear with protective equipment with them, whether they see less lethal options. Again, we've got to mitigate and look at the optic as we staff these events and what that looks like. So people don't feel that, the police are going to stop this event. We are very clear that, look, if an event has been granted to take place, we're there to make sure that it goes off without a hitch.
So last question, could you give us an example of an event that you attended where it didn't go according to plan and the decision had to be made whether or not to pull the plug or not? What are the considerations that go through that process, or what does it look like?
There have been several that we've had, and the first casualty of any battle, as I'll call it, is the plan. Something always changes. We've had events, and I'll talk about one that occurred. It was a Regents meeting, but in 2009, that we had to cancel and stop, and then try to decide how to get both the Regents and everyone else out from a building on campus. And part of that was predicated on the fact that the protesters had surrounded the building. We hadn't had barricades up prior to, lesson learned there. And they had attempted to breach the entry to the building and made it upstairs partway before they were buffed by response teams that we had. But the noise, the sound, the possibility that they were going to skirt around another side of a building when we had officers pulled from those posts to then infiltrate the building and take over the meeting room, and then either hold the staff there hostage, was the time to call it, and brought in our partners from the CHP and local agencies to help staff that. That ended up closing that meeting down for that day. Our planning overnight was to get barricades, get more staffing, lessons learned type thing, to make sure that we kept them at a distance and a perimeter. But they were able to protest again the next day. Those are the kinds of things that we're looking for, and the flashpoints that we've seen, whether it's been Milo and the weapons that have been used against officers. I mean, we're talking about fireworks used as mortars. We've had an officer on our department that was out for months with a concussion from that blast. So we're facing those challenges and how to react to those things, finding them in the crowd, being able to detail a squad or a small element to go talk to those folks and take those weapons away. It's very critical that we are able to monitor the crowd, and when they're happening at night, without cameras, without lighting, without access, it's an extreme challenge.
Thank you very much. Senator Roth.
Thank you. Some of us are a product of the college in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and in my case it was Ohio and the Mid-American Conference in Kent State and Miami, and I remember in the center of campus large crowds and tear gas canisters tossed back and forth. I think in today's environment, given the various weapons that we see all over the place. I think those situations could have been much, much more dangerous if they were occurring today. You mentioned perimeters and weapons screening. Are you in fact able to, consistent with free speech on a college campus, establish effective perimeters and again, effectively screen for weapons and other instruments that can cause law enforcement and others harm?
It's a goal. I can't say with any certainty that, as they approach a venue, the closer they get, the more we have eyes on the attendees and or protesters that get close. We try to make sure in the event that we just had on Monday that those signs and placards are posted identifying what's prohibited, what the banned items are. The LA ordinance, came into effect. That's helpful to notice folks and let them know what they shouldn't be bringing in. And that's a purpose of establishing lines and areas that we can have observation of folks for a period of time as they get closer to a venue.
Are you able to check bags and backpacks or leave them outside? And
so in our last event, we had prohibited backpacks and other bags larger than a small purse or something like that. And if they're going to get inside the venue, we will search those. We had magnetometers outside the entrance to warn people as well.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you have other stories that you could tell, and perhaps we'll have time for some of those. Right now, though, I'd like to go to Acting Commissioner Warren Stanley and Assistant Commissioner Scott Silsby from the California Highway Patrol. Gentlemen, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and Senator Roth, and thank you for giving us opportunity to come before you again. When we came before you in early October, we kind of talked about how we respond to demonstrations from a statewide perspective, and we touched a little bit on how we respond to incidents at the Capitol. And today, Assistant Commissioner Silsby and I, we want to talk about more specifically about the Capitol, how we prepare, how we respond, and then what we learned from some of the protests that have been there over the last several years, and then also this year. And the comment that you made about 10 minutes ago is very appropriate when you said none of this is scripted, and it changes, it evolves, it grows, and the challenge for all of us in this room, all of us in law enforcement, is to preserve the people who come to protest their First Amendment rights, but we also need to maintain public safety. And in talking about the Capitol, we have responsibility for the Capitol. So any protest that's going to be there, we're directly engaged or responsible for putting together the operations plan and doing a risk assessment to determine how we're going to handle that event. One of the first things that we try to do, and it's been mentioned here before today, is we try to talk to the event organizers, the leader or the person who's applying for the permit, and we try to find out, do they plan on getting arrested? Or are they going to try and take over a portion of the Capitol and get that information? Believe it or not, some of these groups, they will pass on that information to us. The other thing we do, and it's been mentioned here before, is we talk to our law enforcement partners in the area. Specifically, when we're dealing with the Capitol, it's the Sacramento Police Department. We have a great working relationship with them, and they are always there to provide us assistance. And then one of the key components, and it's been mentioned here before, is the staffing for these events, trying to find the balance of what is enough to control the incident, to control the protesters. And we're very sensitive to that because we consider, and I'm sure as you do, the Capitol to be the people's house. And we want to make sure that our response is balanced and is justified, because we don't want to give the perception to people that the Capitol is a police state, and we don't want to deter visitors. And also part of our planning, putting together our operations plan or our risk assessment is, like I said, our response. And our response is we want to make sure we preserve free speech and protect state and public property. So part of that is the staffing, is the personnel that go there, that are going to be there to provide safety and security and help deal with the protesters. We want to make sure that they're well trained, they're professional, and they're able to react reasonably to these events. And a lot of times in these cases, and it was mentioned by Lieutenant Littlestone just a minute ago, we use our special response teams that I spoke about earlier at the previous hearing in October. And these are officers, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, chiefs, all the way on up the line that have received additional training. They're specially trained to deal with civil disturbance and other emergencies. And you mentioned a few moments ago about going to see the fires in the Bay Area a couple of weeks ago. We actually even at times use some of our SRT officers for other emergencies like the fire. We use some of them for traffic control, for general law enforcement, and to prevent looting at the fires in the Bay Area that occurred about a month ago. We've also used them. Last year in 2016, we got a request through OES and the EMAC, and we sent 300 officers, including myself and Commissioner Silsby, to the Republican National Convention to help out with the demonstrations there after a request from the Cleveland Police Department and the Ohio State Highway Patrol. So these officers are specially trained. They can respond rapidly. They receive 24 hours of initial certification training, and then annually they go through a 12-hour recertification course. And then I believe this is the key. Once a quarter, they receive 8 hours of additional training, so we can keep their skills at a high level. And I think that's one of the keys in dealing with these protests is the experience of our personnel, the maturity, the professionalism, and that is part of the deterrent when you have personnel out there that are well trained. They can adjust to what's going on because, as you said, a lot of this is not scripted. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Assistant Commissioner Silsby. He's going to talk about how we, a little bit more about how we gather info, how we execute the plan, and then what we've learned after some of these events that have occurred on the Capitol.
Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, Senator Roth, thank you very much for the opportunity. So, as Commissioner Stanley mentioned, that we're in kind of a unique situation with the CHP being a statewide law enforcement. We have the opportunity to see some of these protests in the smaller local areas where they need us for assistance because we have so many trained folks, all the way up to the larger agencies when they may need help. In those capacities, we're assistants, but at the Capitol, it's us. We're the primary. And as Commissioner Stanley said, the governor and you folks all have the opinion as we do, this is the people's house, right? It's also a business. People need to be able to come and go and express their First Amendment rights. People love to have the opportunity to have the Capitol in the background for whatever protest they want to have or whatever event they want to have. The process for the permits at the Capitol is the same for everybody, and it's exactly like my friends over there demonstrated. The reality is it's content neutral. They have, just for administrative purposes, they have about 10 days to get it in writing. We have an online process. We will work with the organizers. There's been times when I've seen a permit signed on somebody's back as the event is happening, so we can make sure everybody's covered as things are going on, so people can express their First Amendment rights. We do some intelligence gathering, much like the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. We have a pretty robust intelligence operation, so we can try to get out and find what's out there, not only on the protesters, but primarily on counter protests. That's kind of what has us going these days. We do work with our allied agencies. We have people on the Joint Terrorism Task Force. We absolutely compare notes with our folks in the STAS. Typically, it's about the same information, but it's always good. Where we find we really excel is the relationships we develop with the folks who are organizing, and we try to develop those relationships with the counter protests. As far as denials go for permits at the Capitol, we have about 1,200 permits a year. We deny on average 230. None of them, except for one very recently, are for public safety reasons, and I'll explain that in just a second. Typically, they're denied because of administrative stuff. People change their mind. They don't realize that they have to have at least one security person for every 50 people. They don't realize the liability, the costs associated with it, and they'll change their mind, and it's technically denied, but it's up to that individual group. Against the people's house, we want to make sure that everybody has the ability to protest. That one denial, the example in 2017, and this is after the big melee that we've heard about at the Capitol, everybody knows of. Group was called Make America Great Again, and we were working very well with the protesters. Then our intelligence showed up that we discovered, as well as the protesting group discovered, said the protesters were encouraging people to bring balloons filled with homemade tear gas, bring rocks, bring other weapons. So that, and they're unpermitted, right? These are the people that are just going to show up. That caused the permitted group to put out on their social media, hey, bring tasers and bring other things to protect yourself. Well, that gave us a hook. You can't bring weapons onto the Capitol, so now we can shut the whole thing down. And so we did. I'll give you a couple other examples. I think you'll see a trend here. In 2011, there was a group called the South Africa Project. And it was a very small group of people, but their cause was alleged white genocide in South Africa. Like I said, about less than 20 people. We were working with the organizers. We made arrangements for them to come onto the Capitol grounds. We would escort them because there was intelligence out there that there would be counter protests. It wasn't overwhelming, but we knew that there would be somebody out there. There was about 40 folks that were, we call counter protesters, but they seemed to be just kind of chanting and going along. After the folks with the SAP stated what they wanted to say, we were walking them out. About that time, that group of 40 counter protesters who all had backpacks on the Capitol dropped their backpacks, pulled out black hoods, masks, and started throwing rocks and balloons filled with homemade tear gas and other stuff. Turned into a altercation, as you can imagine. 2 CHP officers got injured, but that ended that. In 2011, you may recall there were some protests at the Capitol over budget issues at campuses, right? So a well-organized group of students wanted to come in and peacefully protest at the Capitol. They came in, they took over the rotunda, they got the news media came in, which was their goal. They were technically shutting down the operation, which is a business. We could have removed them, but we worked with them. They were happy. The next year, exact same thing was going to happen, but something different happened. This year, they had a different group of people that actually, thanks to our relationship, some of those students came and said, those people aren't with us. We put that in the back of our mind, kept an eye on those folks. The group, as Commissioner Stanley mentioned, the legit group wanted to be arrested, right? They wanted their cause to be caught on camera. Not unusually, we work with people all the time. We'll help you out. We make arrangements to, well, we really do, but we work with them. But of course, they play it up for the camera. But we made the arrest. As we made the arrest, that other group dropped their backpacks, pulled out their hoods, pulled out equipment to do damage to the Capitol and started damaging the Capitol. We had our SRT team off-site because, again, it's 100 people. One team is 100 people. A 12-hour shift cost $80,000, by the way. So they have to come over now because they're off-site, because if they're on-site, then it's a police state, right? So it's always that balance. The time it takes for them to get there, we made some arrests. We got them out of there. The last incident I'll give you an example is the one you're most familiar with. 2016, the Traditionalist Working Party, which is a white national group, they had they pulled a permit, less than 20 people, 12 to 15 folks. We were trying to work with them to make arrangements for when they come on, so we could help them escort them, right? There was plenty of intel out there that there was going to be other counter-protests. They wouldn't tell us where they were coming in. So we tried to staff appropriately. We had, between us and SAC PD, we had a couple hundred law enforcement out there. What happened was they came from the other side of the Capitol. They had better scouts than we did. The counter-protest group saw them, texted their group, and immediately said they're coming on this side, where we didn't have as much of a presence. Let me remind you, it's a 40-acre park that has a business going on in the middle. So as much as I would love to control access around there, the governor tells me he doesn't want to control access to people's house, and I understand. So now it's a sprint. It's the sprint of probably 100 folks that want to run to a fight. And we are now catching up and trying to get there. And that's how the ugliness happened there. It resulted in probably 14 injuries, thousands of dollars damaged, 106 charges recommended to the DA's office, and 4 felony warrants for assault with a deadly weapon and inciting a riot. So lessons learned is very tough on that because, as I mentioned before, we had a couple hundred officers. How do you stop 100 people who were going to sprint to a fight, and it's essentially a gang fight, without either controlled access points all the way around the Capitol where you can check what everybody has, which we don't want to do, to having 100 officers lined up, hundreds of officers lined up around the Capitol. It's tough, it's expensive, and then it's a police state is the concern that comes out from our detractors. So unfortunately, I'll leave you with this. The biggest thing that we've seen change over the years is not so much the protesters, it's the violence that the counter-protesters are willing to go to. Some of these other groups, they're small, nobody's paying attention to them, but the counter-protesters come in, they come in with signs that are weapons. At one point at the Traditionalist Working Party event, we saw a truck pull up unloading crutches, just crutches after crutches after crutches. There wasn't that many people limping, but it was something that they could use as weapons. They had 2x4s with signs on them. Now, signs are restricted at the Capitol, and the sticks that hold the signs are restricted at the Capitol. But on the sidewalk, it's just somebody walking around with a 2x4, and that's not illegal. So it's just a situation. And the best thing that we do it when instance with the freeways is we're very good at relationships with the organizers and getting them to use the situation, working with them to get their media coverage. But this new way of thinking among counter protesters, they don't want to hear it. So happy to take questions.
Thank you. Seems a little daunting because you do get to control the ones wanting to demonstrate, march. The governor doesn't want that. And
let me clarify that, please. I was saying governors in the aggregate, as in the past, people have not wanted that. Typically, it's the people's house. The governor, the legislative body have said, hey, we need to allow people to come and go.
Sure.
Yeah, we can try. But if they're not going to return calls and they're not going to do what we say, typically we want people to be able to come in and express it. We try to work with them. You asked repeatedly, hey, when do you guys make the decision to shut it down? And unfortunately, we almost have to wait till there's some sort of really aggressive act or damage being caused. Otherwise, our detractors will say, you shut it down and you took our opportunity to express our First Amendment right. And then the other side wins.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, law enforcement's in the middle because we truly, not to sound, I always think of the Voltaire quote, which is, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. I don't want to sound pretentious, but it just seems to come into play all the time for law enforcement.
Right. And of course, the Capitol, I'm told, is it receives the second largest number of visitors in the entire state, second only to Disneyland.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of people, and we see them all the time during session. I mean, hundreds, if not thousands, of people coming in and protesting or having rallies, and I mean, it's exciting in that's really the democracy in action. The concern, of course, there and in other instances where the other side of, giving people the right to speak is the fact that it can sometimes lead to either actions or counteractions by others. And interesting, is there, before we go to the last panel, just wondering, you say that you almost have to wait until some violent act occurs.
Well, trust me, I've been in the middle of hundreds of people getting ramped up, and you can feel it coming.
Right.
And there's been times when we can anticipate it, and we'll just start separating. But anybody here who's worn a uniform and been in the middle of them, once you introduce law enforcement now saying, you got to stop this, now we're the target. And now everybody has a reason to fight, and you really have to then really ramp up your use of force, for lack of a better.
It's kind of like what we say about grandparents and grandchildren being so close because they have a common enemy. Okay, so one of the things you sometimes, I mean, I'm wondering, is there anything we can do so that at that moment when you're feeling a bad vibe out there, things are being elevated and escalated, and there are people on both sides that we can do to mitigate before we end up having to, call the whole thing off or see law enforcement intervene in sort of a strong arm way?
One of the discussions that's had often, and it's never really truly resolved as far as I'm concerned, we talk about masks and hooding up and that kind of stuff. there's been talk through the years about maybe changing the California Code of Regulations on the Capitol grounds. I know municipal codes often are changed for events but you have religious affiliation that is affected by that, and then there's holidays that are affected by that. So we hear it starts to gather steam, and then it kind of dies out, and then we're at the next event. But I know you're all aware, the black bloc tactics are to look as indiscriminate as the next person. So when you're committing these crimes, nobody can identify you. And certain elements are getting very good at that.
Thank you. Senator Roth.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just curious, how do you project your staffing requirements when you're anticipating a protest, let's say at the Capitol or somewhere else? Is that where the Fusion folks come in, and do you go online and try to see the volume of message traffic and find out what people are going to do? And it's a compound question, and if so, maybe we ought to look at this aggregation of data. And
it's a little bit of all that. It's the intelligence information that we gather and we get from our partners. It's past practices. A lot of times these protesters, we've dealt with them before, either at the Capitol or other events, so we kind of have an understanding of their game plan and understanding of how many people are going to be there. It's the information they post online about how many people have taken a look at it and how many people are say they're going to come. And the history, some of these protests, they happen on an annual basis, so we kind of get an idea of how many people may show up. And then also it's what else is going on in the world or in the United States that may impact this. If there's something else going on that can elevate the level of the event and make more people, cause more people to show up to it.
Yeah, absolutely, and we now are leaning on the side of throw more at it, unfortunately, which is because we do the balance. But my insurance card says throw as many law enforcement as you can stand, and it has a tremendous impact on the budget, as you can imagine.
Got it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And that is one of the real questions, is the cost. Who should be carrying that burden? If it's the entity that gets the permit, then the costs get too high. The argument is we're denying them free speech. On the other hand, I don't think the University of California has a budget large enough to accommodate regular weekly visits from people who evoke the kind of response that requires we protect them from the possibility of harm when they speak. So I think we're going to have to continue pursuing that discussion as we go forward. And if you have any suggestions, I'm sure Senator Roth, who pinches pennies like nobody's business, would be very interested in that. So we have next Mark Pazin, Chief Law Enforcement Branch of the Governor's Office of Emergency Services. Chief?
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me. Yeah, you may have to get an endowed chair for the at the campuses there, Lieutenant. But you're exactly right. It is a new world order for what we are dealing with now. The Cal OES Law Enforcement Branch, under the Cal OES Director and Governor's Homeland Security Advisor, Mark Ghilarducci, maintains the law enforcement mutual aid system here in California. As the Chief Law Enforcement for this branch, I am the State Law Enforcement Mutual Aid Coordinator, with my responsibilities including mutual aid response, coordination, and administrative interaction between state and local law enforcement agencies during emergency and non-emergency situations. I won't belabor what the other panelists have gone through. I'll just get to the meat of the matter here. A request for law enforcement mutual aid requires the approval of the Chief Law Enforcement Officer that's assisting in that particular jurisdiction, and a duly authorized sworn staff or command officer acting on behalf of the sheriff or the police chief on a planned or unplanned event. The mutual aid is intended to augment local law enforcement resources that have become overwhelmed or strained as a result of unplanned circumstances requiring an emergency response. We call it chaotic continuity, quite frankly. So with that, we can have all the proper planning we wish, and there have been, and with all the folks that you have listened to here on these panels, we work quite well together. But I want to leave you with this thought and entertain any questions here, is that the system works. Just recently, Madam Chair, you had a flight up to the fires, mutual aid, state and local. We had protests, planned, unplanned, mutual aid, state and local. The thought process here is that the system works. And then you asked another question about free speech. When does it become a law enforcement issue? I would submit to you in this amorphous law enforcement arena that we deal with is when free speech turns into a free-for-all, and that balance that we have to manage at that point in time. We are able to move along with the California Highway Patrol under the direction of Commissioner Warren Stanley and Deputy Commissioner, right, Scott Silsby. This hundreds of personnel to these events. It is monumental with those persons with the fires, the floods that we had at the first of the year, and again, not to reiterate with these planned protests and unplanned. So basically, I'll leave you with this thought. The system works, and I'll entertain any questions, and then I'll pass it on to the general here.
Thank you very much. I just have one question for you. You basically come in under the mutual aid system, which I have seen work both, in the air, on the ground, and in my own community. So I know that that is true. But you get called in, is it usually before an event or while it's happening, with a free speech or hate speech or demonstration or whatever we want to call the activity? Are you part of the planning process, or do you come in sort of as the supplemental agency to assist?
Great question, and we'll go to planned event, Super Bowl 50. We were there from the get-go as Homeland Security Advisor, assisting Director Ghilarducci, went off without a hitch. Again, CHP was right there, and we had two large venues where the actual football game was at Levi Stadium, but all the events were happening in San Francisco. Highway 101 looked like a human anthill with that whole week, people going back and forth on that. We'll go ahead to what was going on in Berkeley. We were there from the get-go, planning events and ensuring that we had assistant chiefs there assisting the regional mutual aid coordinator at that particular time, and still is Sheriff Greg Ahern out of Alameda County.
Unfortunately, some of these events, we plan for them and then they turn violent. And, at what point are you able to effectively provide officers and what have you if there's hopefully these violent events are limited in time, because the longer they go on, the more people get hurt. So in some instances, you're there at the beginning, but have there been incidents when you've provided advice, you haven't been there because there was no expectation of a problem, but a problem occurred, you're called, has it been effective, or is there too much time that elapses so that you're not able to provide that additional assistance? I'm not saying we can be at every event. I'm just wondering, in that great 2020 hindsight, are there any incidents where you weren't there and may have been helpful had you been there, and lessons learned from that?
I think it's from past practice that we understand what events are going to have issues at, and I'll defer to either Scott or Warren. Again, free speech turns into a free-for-all. I think there was the Milo effect that occurred, wherein we put a lot of resources, coordinate with the Highway Patrol and the regional mutual aid coordinator out of Alameda County. They had one unfortunate set of criminal activity, but then after that, we kind of caught on, and they had more than ample law enforcement mutual aid there in cooperation with the CHP.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Roth.
Chief, just I'm curious, one question. Can you address the interoperability of our law enforcement communication resources statewide in terms of frequencies, radios?
Sure.
Ability to chat?
You know, that's always a challenge. We have during mutual aid, but what we have at Cal OES is what we call the MIGU, M-I-G-U. It's the Mobile Interoperability Ground Unit. And so we're able to coordinate interoperability with land mobile radios. We have a cache of radios that we can put out that have been used effectively. I think the director, looking prospectively, wants to ensure that we have that through Homeland Security funding and that we all have the radios. But we do have CLAMARS, the California Law Enforcement Mutual Aid Radio System. 154.92, everybody has that, and that is also part of our incident action plan, if that helps you.
So if agencies need to, if units from agencies need to talk to each other, they can use that particular system to do it?
Yes, on the high band system, yes.
Okay. Thank
Sir, if I might, just FYI, the larger agencies also have mobile command posts that can do that with their large RVs. So many of the larger agencies, but still, some of these events, OES comes in and saves the day with their units as well.
Does that mean the mobile units, Chief, in your case, and CHP, does that mean the mobile units have to relay communications between units from agencies that do not use compatible communications equipment?
Sometimes, yeah.
Okay.
It's brought up one other thought.
Yeah.
You provide mutual aid. Are there instances, or have you heard of any, where local jurisdictions have chosen not to ask for mutual aid because of the cost?
Well, quite frankly, the cost is borne by that agency. It's neighbor helping neighbor. We just saw what happened with the fires, Mendocino ripping right through down into Yuba and counties. The next set of incidents could be the flooding down in Southern California. We could be moving those law enforcement resources down there. Probably going to go out on a limb here. I'm at will. I may not see you tomorrow, but I think that, if I may.
Check his microphone, please.
Yes, yes. Reggie is here to be my checks and balances, but I do firmly believe that at some point in time, you have alluded to the cost. Let's just cut to the question of how we're going to do that at some point in time legislatively to have some type of pool of funding, whether it's for the local agency, the highway patrol, UC system, Cal State, you name it, state parks, that during these events, broad brush at events, at some point in time, we're going to have to address the monumental funding that it costs.
Well, let me ask that. I've been a budget sub-chair now for 5 years, and if I'm at will too, so if I'm still around, maybe I will be next year.
Good. We'll be working.
At least in my assignments, I'm at will. Do we not provide in the public safety arena, do we not attempt to project emergency services needs in the budget, and then where those needs are exceeded, or the resources are exceeded, don't we then go back in the current year budget and make some adjustments?
Let me digress, and then we'll move forward. I did my first 32 years in law enforcement, Merced County Sheriff's Office, 3 terms as the elected sheriff there. And just like anything else, you have to go through the process. What do you project out as what you are going to need for your agency, just like everybody else does here sitting on this panel? How do you predict an unplanned event? How do you predict a fire, a flood that causes hundreds of first responders? And I haven't even got into the fire side and EMS. I would submit to you that there has to be some dialogue that has to be started to address the funding mechanism at some point in time. We can get a federal disaster. Okay, that pays, I believe, 75% under an FMAG. We can go CDAA that pays another percentile for the locals, but that's still what happened in Tehama County just yesterday. We had a quasi-mutual aid assistance with CHP, but they had the FBI, one crime scene, Department of Justice, a crime scene. They had DA's office. I say this as a platform that how do you know when someone's going to go sideways, and how much of that cost Sheriff Dave Hencrat there, and they're probably still on the scene, if that makes any sense.
Well, I mean, that's why I'm saying, obviously, you don't know what you don't know, so you have to plan for a certain type of contingency and resources in the budget, and then undoubtedly, depending on the year, that those resources are going to go away because you're going to spend them, and then we have to have a mechanism for supplementing that budget. It's difficult in the counties because they're challenged anyway, so the question is, as a state, should we be taking a role to have some money available to supplement both the federal relief and this other type that you were talking about? I'd like to have a discussion with you on that. It's a little bit beyond this, and my chair is going to give me the hook in a minute. But thank you.
And I encourage that. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Chief Payson.
And I think that's a question we're all trying to deal with. What was it estimated, $1 million at Berkeley for the first Milo speech, or I mean, that's ridiculous. And the university would be far better off being able to redirect that money to educating its students in many different ways. So I will encourage you to speak to the good senator here because he has a very sharp pencil and I think would be very helpful to us. Our last speaker before a public comment, but before we get to that, I do have a few questions for the group, but Major General David Baldwin, who is the Adjutant General for the California Military Department. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Senator Roth. The role of the National Guard during special events and large public gatherings is to provide a broad spectrum of military capability that we make available to local law enforcement and incident commanders to help them protect the public. Happily, because of the law enforcement mutual aid system that Chief Payson just described, which frankly is the best in the country, bar none, the California National Guard has been called on relatively few times to participate in any of the recent events. As we discussed before the hearing began, Senator, the last time the National Guard really got involved in a large-scale on-street mission was during the 1992 riots, which was a result of poor planning. A lot of lessons learned came out of that now have resulted in this splendid system we have here in California that enables law enforcement entities to assist each other. We have provided a nominal amount of support to Sheriff Ahern in Alameda County to assist with events and free speech events in Berkeley, where we provide unique military mission commands, what we call mission command systems, which assist with command and control to enable law enforcement agencies to be able to have better visibility through web-based systems on where their officers are, where the fire and EMS personnel are in real time, so that it helps with some of those issues that come with interoperability with radios, because the incident commander has provided tools by us that allow them to see in real time where everybody is on the law enforcement side. The last time that we did anything close to a large-scale event that was not a free speech event then, arguably it probably is a free speech event today, was Super Bowl 50, as Chief Payson mentioned. In that event, we deployed around 1,000 soldiers and airmen and employed our entire spectrum of capability that we can use here domestically. But in the law enforcement side, the best use of the National Guard during events like these is to assign tasks for our security forces that can free up sworn peace officers to go out and actually interact with the public. So we take fixed site security. We take areas that the police have already cleared, areas that may be staging areas that can then, again, free up, that we can secure, that can free up sworn peace officers to go out and actually enforce the law. We do have the capability to do on-street crowd control missions. We train many of our units to do that. We train our military police and security force units in using less lethal options, but it is always a better idea to have professional peace officers that do it on a regular basis out there interacting with the public. We have all the authorities that we need for employment of the National Guard and the California Military Department to support our law enforcement partners. If we come across any areas that we could use improvement or help, we'll certainly let you know if we have any legislative ideas to improve it. The one thing that we are continuing to work on that we can do a better job within the California Military Department is to get out to all of the law enforcement jurisdictions. We work closely with the sheriffs mainly, but we have to spend more time getting out to some of the smaller jurisdictions to brief them and advise them on our capabilities to see what they have. And when we deploy the National Guard in support of a local jurisdiction, we don't charge them for that. But it does incur a cost back to the state, which goes along the lines of the discussions you just had with Chief Payson. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to ask a broad question and get your insights. But first, in the time we've had, do you have any suggestions that where a legislative fix might help you be able to be more effective, whether it's in determining how many officers are needed, whether it's just getting, if possible, a better definition of when it's time to shut something down or not? Anything legislatively that you might have to provide us with so that we can give some thought to it as we consider how to make it all work better? No? Well, why don't I then suggest, if you come up with anything, that you let us know. I have a question that relates to this in a very broad way, and that is, the day after this president was inaugurated, 3 million people around the world virtually spontaneously protested and demonstrated against this presidency. And among 3 million people, my understanding is there was not a single incident, there was not a single arrest, there was not a single incident of violence. And I'll tell you, I happened to be at the protest in Los Angeles, where they were expecting 100,000 people, and about 750,000 people showed up. And you talk about the 101 looking like ants. I was literally stuck for 45 minutes, unable to move, with my nose in some poor man's armpit. That's how crowded it was. And I really am not kidding you when I say that. And yet there wasn't a single incident where people started having road rage or whatever you might call this. And yet we look today, people are protesting. I mean, the signs weren't quite as horrific as some of the suggestions at the Charlottesville event. I don't think people were quite as provoked, but there were some that were pretty strong, but no violence. And so I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that. Why, with 3 million people around the world protesting, and there were 250,000 in Chicago when they expected 50,000, and how many in Sacramento when they expected 5,000? I mean, it was this huge spontaneous set of demonstrations, and the police, I think, were extraordinary. At least in LA, there was a presence, but it was very, very understated. No need for any police to be called upon other than just to be there kind of waving. When someone waved at them, the little kids would wave, they'd wave back. That was really it. How does that happen? And you look today, fast forward, and we are so petrified about violence taking place when demonstrations are occurring that it's costing us millions and millions of dollars. Any thoughts on that? Well, again, if you come up with any thoughts, I mean, it's a question I've been asking myself as I've been seeing all of the violent behaviors. How is it that there wasn't a single incident? And people were not happy, I can assure you. They were mad. And I think the police did a great job because they didn't do anything. And there was no need for them to do anything. Law enforcement did exactly what it needed to do, which was nothing. But why was it that the people protesting were not violent? What is happening? Is there something we can identify so that we can address it, so that we can allow people to exercise their First Amendment rights, so that law enforcement is not in harm's way when you enforce the peace, and so that we don't have this problem associated with the violence and the confrontations that seem to be creating, the reason that we're here today. So with that, that's really all I had to ask, other than certainly there are some themes that we've been hearing. And so it's time for public comment, and we've got 15 minutes. I don't know how many people would like to speak. I know we have at least one. So if you'd step up to the microphone, and anyone who would like to speak would like to give you 2 minutes. And thank you. If you would identify yourself and your affiliation, and it's yours.
Well, good afternoon, Senator Jackson, Senator Roth, and panelists. My name is Mario Guerrero. I am here on behalf of the California Faculty Association. As you know, many of the recent hate speech events have taken place on college campuses, and in particular, the California State University campus system, and that is why my comments will focus on the CSU. We have heard in previous hearings that the solution to hate speech is more speech. However, statements that have been issued by the campus presidents in response to hate speech do not rise to that challenge. They have either been silent or have been inadequate. The CSU administration must, each and every single time hate speech is brought to campus, denounce it and call it what it is: white supremacy, white nationalism, and neo-Nazism. At the last CSU Board of Trustees meeting, CFA suggested concrete actions the CSU could take to address hate speech. Among them were increased counseling center resources to assist students, mandating anti-racism training for campus police, working with campus communities to create clear and transparent protocols when hate groups come on campus, acknowledge that protecting students, faculty, and staff is of the utmost importance over allowing hate speech, and that the CSU may have a moral imperative to act accordingly. Engage in complex discussions on what free speech means and have these discussions on campus. Analyze the cost of hate speech. On that last point, CFA has submitted a public records request to the CSU regarding the costs from the last Milo Yiannopoulos event held at Cal State Fullerton, including the cost of security. We think that the legislature may want to know this information, and we hope that you will help us ensure that the CSU provides this information. The conversation around hate speech must include a conversation about the cost of hate speech, both the impact to people and the financial cost. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good points. Much appreciated. If you would provide us with, if there is an official statement that includes those suggestions. Again, our first hearing, we had a very robust discussion about many of the issues you've just raised, and yet we still have a First Amendment in this country, and that becomes part of the challenge. Certainly education, I think, would help everybody, and for this group, the protocols, I think that there are protocols that are being developed, as I understood the testimony here today. The cost is enormous, but how do we deal with that First Amendment? Is the cost of trying to control it and undermine it greater to a democracy than the cost of making sure we enforce it? I guess that's a sort of a philosophical question we're not going to answer here today, but certainly it's part of the discussion that we have had and need to have. Are there any other public comments? Well, I'll take that as my close. Senator Roth, would you like to?
Thank you for including me.
You're very welcome, all of you, and thank you, Senator Roth, for joining us. If you have any other comments or thoughts, if this has provoked some concerns or ideas, please let us know. I chair this joint committee on emergency management, and I was specifically tasked with this a series of hearings in order to address what is really a fundamental challenge in today's world, and appreciate all you're doing to help us with that as well. And with that, we'll stand adjourned.
Good job.
This is the California State University Office of the Chancellor's live stream. Please adjust your audio accordingly. This is the California State University Office of the Chancellor's live stream. Please adjust your audio accordingly. This is the California State University Office of the Chancellor's live stream. Please adjust your audio accordingly. This is the California State University Office